Throughout history and across nearly every culture, there exist accounts of children who claim to remember lives they lived in previous centuries, describing specific names of deceased individuals, the circumstances of their deaths, and intimate details about families and places they could not possibly have encountered in their current existence. These children often speak with striking conviction about their past identities, sometimes even displaying emotional trauma related to how they believe they died in those former lives. And in many documented cases, researchers have verified that the details provided by these young subjects matched historical records with an accuracy that defies simple coincidence or parental suggestion. The theory posits that consciousness does not simply cease upon death, but rather transfers into a new body, carrying fragments of memory and personality that occasionally surface in the early years of childhood before being gradually obscured by the accumulation of new experiences and the cognitive demands of growing up. Psychologists have proposed various alternative explanations for these phenomena, suggesting that children may be absorbing information from their environment through subtle cues, family conversations, or media exposure that their conscious minds have not registered, but their subconscious has cataloged with remarkable detail. Others argue that children possess naturally vivid imaginations and a tendency toward confabulation, the construction of false memories that feel entirely real to the person experiencing them, and that when these imaginative narratives happen to align with historical facts, we remember those cases while forgetting the countless instances where children's claims bear no resemblance to reality whatsoever. Consider for a moment the strange intersection between quantum mechanics and consciousness, a theoretical framework that suggests your subjective experience of reality might be far more resilient than death itself would ordinarily allow. Quantum immortality proposes that from the perspective of your own consciousness, you can never actually experience dying, because the universe itself is fundamentally probabilistic at the quantum level, and your awareness will always find itself following the path of probability where you continue to exist. Imagine standing before a scenario where death seems certain, perhaps a terminal diagnosis or a dangerous situation with seemingly no escape, and yet somehow against all odds, an improbable recovery occurs, or a miraculous accident prevents the outcome, or some inexplicable coincidence ensures your survival when the mathematics suggested otherwise. According to this theory, this is not mere luck or blessed fortune, but rather the inevitable branching of quantum reality into multiple timelines, where in most branches you do indeed perish, yet your subjective consciousness can only ever experience the branches where you survive, making immortality from the first-person perspective a mathematical certainty rather than a miracle. The mechanism rests upon the interpretation that consciousness is somehow fundamental to quantum observation, and that the universe must collapse into states compatible with the continued existence of the observer, creating an invisible selection bias where you perpetually find yourself in the improbable timeline where you somehow persist. Among the most compelling accounts in reincarnation literature are the cases of young children who spontaneously recall details from lives they claim to have lived before their birth, often with startling accuracy and specificity that seems far beyond their cognitive capacity or life experience. These children, typically between the ages of 2 and 7, describe people they have never met, places they have never visited, and circumstances they could not possibly know through conventional means, speaking with an emotional intensity and conviction that troubles even skeptical observers. Some remember the names of deceased relatives, the precise manner of their previous death, architectural details of homes in distant villages, or the names of family members from another country and another century. One of the most famous cases involved a boy in Lebanon who remembered being a murdered man, correctly identifying his killer from a lineup of photographs, or a child in India who guided researchers to a hidden cache of money buried by his purported former self. The mechanism proposed by those who study such phenomena suggests that the human brain, particularly in childhood when neural pathways remain unusually plastic and permeable, might retain impressions or memories from a previous consciousness that have not yet been fully overwritten by the continuous process of accumulation that characterizes ordinary life and development. Some theorists propose that children possess a temporary window of access to what might be called previous life data, similar to how certain animals retain instinctual knowledge that appears ancestral rather than learned, and that this access gradually closes as the brain matures and integrates more fully with the present lifetime's experiences and conditioning. Imagine standing at the edge of an infinite corridor where every moment you have ever experienced stretches backward and forward into eternity, repeating itself endlessly without variation or escape. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche proposed a thought experiment that would later become known as eternal recurrence, the peculiar notion that the universe operates in cycles of infinite repetition, doomed to replay every atom, every thought, every conversation, every heartbreak in exactly the same sequence forever. In this framework, your life is not a singular journey toward some distant destination, but rather a loop that has already occurred infinite times before and will occur infinite times again, with no memory of the previous iterations and no hope of variation in the iterations yet to come. When considered through the lens of reincarnation, eternal recurrence suggests that you have not merely lived many lives across different forms and circumstances, but rather that you are living the exact same life repeatedly, experiencing the same version of yourself as a peasant, then as a merchant, then as a philosopher, then as dust, cycling through the identical sequence without end. This framework removes the comforting element of progress or spiritual growth that traditional reincarnation offers, replacing it instead with austere vision of cosmic repetition. The psychological mechanism that allows this theory to persist in human consciousness, despite its seemingly depressing implications, relates to how we construct meaning from patterns and cycles we observe in nature. We recognize that seasons repeat, that days follow nights in endless succession, that human behavior mirrors ancestral behavior across generations, and we extrapolate these observable patterns into a comprehensive metaphysics. Consider the peculiar observation that has captured the imagination of believers in reincarnation for centuries: the striking correlation between birthmarks and the locations of fatal wounds from past lives. According to this theory, when a person dies from a traumatic injury, a gunshot wound to the chest, a knife wound to the abdomen, or blunt force trauma to the head, the imprint of that wound somehow transcends death itself and reappears on the newborn body in the exact same anatomical location. Parents discover these marks on their infants and wonder aloud whether their child might be a returning soul, bearing physical evidence of a violent end in a previous existence. The birthmark becomes a map, a literal cartography of someone else's final moments, transferred through the mysterious corridors of rebirth into this new incarnation. Medical science explains birthmarks through entirely different mechanisms, attributing them to benign vascular malformations or accumulations of pigment-producing cells during fetal development. Yet the reincarnation theory persists because birthmarks are genuinely present, visible, and permanent. The human mind finds profound meaning in coincidence, especially when a child's unusual marking happens to align with a narrative of past life trauma that a parent or family member introduces into the story. What begins as a simple observation of an unusual skin condition becomes transformed, through the lens of belief and cultural transmission, into evidence of cosmic continuity and the persistence of identity across death itself. The theory endures not because it explains birthmarks better than dermatology does, but because it offers a comforting sense that marks upon our bodies carry significance beyond random chance, that even our physical imperfections tell stories of souls journeying endlessly through time. Consider the concept of samsara, a Sanskrit term from Hindu and Buddhist philosophy that describes the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that traps all sentient beings in a perpetual wheel of existence. And imagine instead a modern interpretation where this ancient idea manifests not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a psychological pattern embedded so deeply within human consciousness that we experience it as an inescapable loop of desires, attachments, and suffering in our daily lives. In this theory, samsara is not merely a spiritual concept relegated to ancient texts and meditation halls, but rather a genuine cognitive mechanism wherein our brains become hardwired to repeat the same patterns of wanting, obtaining, losing, and wanting again, creating a neurological feedback system that mirrors the traditional Buddhist understanding of cyclical rebirth on a much smaller, more immediate timescale. We find ourselves caught in perpetual loops where we desire something intensely, achieve it, experience temporary satisfaction, and then almost immediately shift our attention to the next object of desire, never truly achieving lasting contentment, as if we are reborn into new cycles of craving every single day without ever escaping the fundamental structure of the wheel. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the hedonic treadmill, wherein our brains adapt to new circumstances with remarkable speed, and what once brought us profound joy becomes our baseline expectation within weeks or months, forcing us ever onward toward fresh sources of stimulation and satisfaction. We normalize this experience so thoroughly that we rarely question whether this constant cycling through desire and disappointment represents some fundamental truth about existence or merely a deeply ingrained mental habit that we could theoretically interrupt if we possessed the awareness and discipline to do so. Yet generation after generation perpetuates the same pattern, as if bound by invisible chains that keep us spinning endlessly forward. In Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, there exists a state of being called the Bardo, which describes an intermediate realm that consciousness inhabits between the moment of death and the moment of rebirth into a new life. A transitional space that supposedly lasts for up to 49 days, where the soul encounters various visions, divine beings, and terrifying apparitions that reflect the accumulated karma and spiritual development of the deceased individual. According to this tradition, the Bardo is not a physical location, but rather a psychological and metaphysical dimension where the consciousness experiences intense phenomena without the anchor of a physical body, where every thought manifests instantly, and where the boundaries between internal reality and external experience dissolve completely. The theory suggests that the deceased person may not even realize they have died, and that they encounter peaceful and wrathful deities, celestial beings, and their own projections of fear and desire, each manifestation serving as a teaching opportunity to guide the soul toward either enlightenment or toward choosing their next incarnation. The mechanism behind this belief rests on the observation that consciousness in life is heavily filtered through sensory experience and bodily constraint, so when freed from these limitations, it might experience reality in a radically different way, where the mind becomes so powerful and unmediated that internal imagery and psychological content become indistinguishable from external phenomena. This theory has persisted for centuries within Tibetan Buddhism, not because it offers verifiable evidence about what happens after death, but because it provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the psychological journey of dying itself, a poetic map of the human mind's deepest fears and aspirations projected onto the moment of ultimate transformation. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit office or therapy room, reclining in a comfortable chair while a trained practitioner speaks to you in slow, measured tones, guiding your consciousness backward through time itself, deeper and deeper into a state of profound relaxation until you find yourself standing in a completely different world, dressed in unfamiliar clothing, speaking languages you have never learned, living out scenes from centuries past with vivid sensory detail and emotional authenticity. Past life regression represents one of the most compelling narratives in contemporary spirituality, offering individuals the promise that through hypnosis or guided meditation, they can access genuine memories stored somewhere in their consciousness from previous incarnations, and that these memories, once accessed, can explain inexplicable fears, recurring dreams, unexplained talents, mysterious relationships, or persistent health conditions that have plagued them throughout their current lifetime. The mechanism proposed by believers relies on the idea that consciousness itself is not bound by the individual brain, that memories are somehow encoded within the soul or spirit and travel with it across multiple lives, and that under deep hypnotic states, the critical faculties of the mind relax sufficiently to allow these hidden memories to surface and become accessible to conscious awareness. What actually occurs during these sessions, according to psychological research, involves the interplay between suggestion, imagination, and the natural tendency of the human mind to construct narrative coherence from ambiguous stimuli, combined with the powerful effects of hypnosis on memory formation and the susceptibility of our brains to false memory creation. Particularly when authority figures suggest specific scenarios or ask leading questions that make certain memories seem more plausible than others. Consider the widespread belief that karma operates as a cosmic accounting system, where every action you take generates an invisible spiritual debt or credit that inevitably returns to you in this lifetime or the next, and observe how this theory persists across cultures despite the complete absence of any measurable mechanism by which such a system could function. When someone experiences misfortune, we often hear people say they must have deserved it through actions in a past life, or conversely, when someone experiences unusual fortune, we attribute it to positive karma accumulated from previous incarnations or virtuous behavior in the present one. This creates a self-sealing narrative in which all outcomes, both favorable and unfavorable, can be explained retroactively by the karma theory, making it impossible to falsify or disprove through observation alone. The psychological appeal of karma lies in its promise of cosmic justice and order, satisfying our deep human need to believe that the universe operates fairly and that morality has built-in consequences that transcend individual human agency or random chance. It allows us to impose meaning on suffering by suggesting that pain serves a purpose of spiritual refinement, while simultaneously providing a framework that protects us from confronting the uncomfortable possibility that sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason whatsoever. The karma theory also conveniently places moral responsibility entirely on the individual's current or past actions, which paradoxically can lead to victim blaming where those who suffer are told their circumstances are deserved. Yet we maintain this belief system despite its logical circularity and its failure to explain why virtuous people often experience genuine hardship while unethical individuals frequently prosper. Imagine a theory that bridges the gap between quantum physics and the ancient concept of reincarnation, suggesting that consciousness itself operates according to the strange rules of the quantum world, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, and where information can never truly be destroyed, only transformed. Quantum reincarnation proposes that when a person dies, their consciousness does not simply vanish into nothingness, but rather enters a quantum superposition, existing in a state of infinite possibility across multiple timelines and dimensions simultaneously, until the moment of birth arrives when a new observer collapses this wave function and anchors that consciousness into a singular new body and new life. The mechanism behind this theory rests on the interpretation of quantum mechanics that suggests consciousness plays a fundamental role in collapsing quantum waves and creating observable reality, combined with the principle of quantum information preservation, which states that information cannot be destroyed in the universe, but only redistributed, recombined, and transformed into new configurations. When applied to consciousness, this would mean that the pattern of awareness and experience that constituted your previous life continues to exist in some form within the quantum substrate of reality itself, waiting in a state of indeterminacy until circumstances align for its reintegration into biological form. Consider the widespread belief that somewhere in the world exists a single person who is your perfect mirror, your cosmic counterpart, the other half of your soul that was separated at the beginning of time and is now searching desperately through the vastness of human existence to reunite with you, and that when you finally meet this person, you will experience a recognition so profound, so instantaneous, and so overwhelming that all doubt will evaporate, and you will simply know, with absolute certainty, that you have found your predetermined destiny. This theory suggests that twin flames are not merely soulmates or compatible partners, but rather two halves of one unified consciousness that chose to incarnate separately for the purpose of spiritual growth and eventual reunion, and that the pain and longing you feel when separated from this person is actually evidence of the cosmic bond that connects you across dimensions and through multiple lifetimes of reincarnation. The mechanism underlying this belief appears to function through a combination of romantic idealization, the human tendency to seek meaning in intense emotional connections, and a profound desire to believe that love is not random, but rather orchestrated by something greater than chance. When people experience powerful attraction or deep connection with another person, the twin flame theory provides a ready-made narrative that elevates this experience beyond mere chemistry or compatibility, transforming it into something faded and eternally significant, something that validates the intensity of the feeling and eliminates the uncertainty that typically accompanies human relationships. What persists as remarkable is how thoroughly this concept has embedded itself into modern spiritual discourse despite lacking any measurable criteria for verification, any biological mechanism, or any logical explanation for how the universe would track and coordinate the simultaneous incarnation of two specific souls among billions of people across centuries. In the late 1990s, a young boy named James Leininger from Louisiana began exhibiting behaviors and knowledge that seemed inexplicable for a child of his age, claiming with remarkable specificity that he had been a fighter pilot during World War II who died in combat over the Pacific Ocean. James would describe in vivid detail the experience of being shot down, experiencing sudden, intense pain, and losing consciousness, along with specific information about aircraft models naval terminology, and historical events that he should have had no way of knowing at such a young age. His parents, particularly his father Bruce Leininger, documented these claims extensively, noting that James would wake from nightmares screaming about being on fire and falling from the sky, demonstrating an emotional intensity that seemed far beyond typical childhood fears. Over time, researchers and paranormal investigators became involved, and through careful documentation and cross-referencing with historical military records, many of James's claims were verified, including details about specific pilots who had died during the war, aircraft serial numbers, and battle locations that matched historical accounts with surprising precision. The psychological mechanism proposed by those who support reincarnation explanations suggests that traumatic memories from a past life, particularly violent deaths, can imprint themselves so deeply on a person's consciousness that they persist across the boundary of death and rebirth, manifesting as seemingly irrational phobias, inexplicable knowledge, or compulsive behavioral patterns in the subsequent incarnation. Yet the case remains embedded within popular culture and continues to captivate audiences despite the existence of alternative explanations involving cryptomnesia, false memory, and the remarkable suggestibility of children, which neuroscience and psychology have thoroughly documented as powerful forces in shaping how young minds interpret and remember information presented to them through various sources, media, and parental influence. Imagine a person under hypnotic regression suddenly speaking fluently in a language they have never studied, pronouncing words with native accuracy and understanding grammar that would take years of conventional learning to acquire. Yet upon returning to normal consciousness, they remember nothing of what they said and cannot replicate the ability when awake. This phenomenon, known as xenoglossy, represents one of the more perplexing claims in reincarnation research, suggesting that the human mind contains linguistic knowledge from past lives that somehow becomes accessible only in altered states of consciousness. Cases have been documented where individuals have allegedly spoken Sanskrit, ancient Egyptian, medieval German, or obscure regional dialects with such precision that linguists have expressed bewilderment, unable to explain how such knowledge could have been acquired through normal channels in the person's current lifetime. The theoretical mechanism behind xenoglossy within reincarnation frameworks proposes that the soul carries linguistic imprints from previous incarnations, memories of languages spoken in former lives that remain encoded in some deeper layer of consciousness, beyond the reach of ordinary waking awareness, but potentially accessible through hypnosis, meditation, or other altered mental states that supposedly thin the veil between present and past selves. From a psychological perspective, however, researchers have suggested far more conventional explanations involving cryptomnesia, the forgotten memory of information encountered years ago that resurfaces unexpectedly under specific conditions, or perhaps even the mind's remarkable capacity for pattern recognition and unconscious processing that could simulate fluency through exposure to linguistic material that was never consciously registered. Imagine meeting someone for the first time and feeling an inexplicable sense of familiarity, as though you have known them across multiple lifetimes, or conversely, encountering a person toward whom you feel an instant and profound aversion despite having no rational basis for such a reaction. The theory of soul contracts proposes that before we are born into this life, our souls make deliberate agreements with other souls, establishing the nature and purpose of our future relationships, whether those relationships will be characterized by deep love, bitter conflict, mutual growth, or painful separation. According to this framework, the people who appear in our lives most significantly are not there by chance but by cosmic appointment, bound to us through pre-incarnational negotiations that our conscious minds cannot remember but our souls recognize with absolute certainty. When we experience those moments of inexplicable connection or inexplicable friction with another person, we are supposedly encountering the fulfillment of agreements made in the non-physical realm before either soul chose to enter material existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to stem from our profound human need to find meaning and purpose in our relationships, particularly in those connections that seem either too fortunate or too difficult to be merely coincidental. When we attribute our encounters to soul contracts rather than acknowledging them as random or the result of circumstance, we transform potentially meaningless interactions into purposeful spiritual arrangements, which provides tremendous comfort and a sense of cosmic order. This framework also allows us to reframe our suffering within relationships as something we chose for our own spiritual evolution rather than something that happened to us without purpose, which fundamentally changes how we experience pain. Consider the peculiar notion that before we are born into this world, our souls or consciousness exist in some form of prenatal state where we possess agency and awareness, and that during this ethereal waiting period, we somehow review and select the parents who will raise us during our earthly existence. According to this theory, the circumstances of your birth, the specific genetic material you inherited, and the family environment into which you emerged were not products of random biological chance, but rather deliberate choices made by your own spiritual essence. The soul in this framework examines potential parents as if reviewing candidates for a crucial life partnership, assessing their emotional capacity, their karmic debts, their psychological strengths and weaknesses, and their ability to provide the exact circumstances needed for the soul's spiritual evolution during that particular incarnation. This theory attempts to explain why certain individuals report feeling inexplicably connected to their parents or conversely experience the opposite, and it reframes even the most traumatic childhoods as conscious selections made by the soul for purposes of growth and learning. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief involves a profound human need to find meaning in suffering and to assert agency over circumstances we cannot control. When we believe we chose our parents, we transform ourselves from helpless victims of circumstance into active participants in our own destiny, which provides tremendous psychological comfort. This belief persists in modern culture despite having no empirical support whatsoever, woven throughout spiritual communities, parenting discussions, and therapeutic contexts where individuals explore their family dynamics through this lens. We have normalized this theory to such an extent that people speak of their difficult childhoods as chosen lessons without examining whether this narrative genuinely serves their healing or simply enables them to rationalize suffering as inevitable. In 1901, a physician named Duncan MacDougall conducted an experiment that would ripple through popular culture and spiritual thinking for more than a century, fundamentally shaping how many people imagine the physical nature of the soul itself. MacDougall placed 6 dying patients on a specially designed bed that functioned as a sensitive scale, one so precise that it could measure minute changes in weight with extraordinary accuracy, and he waited for the moment of death to arrive so that he could record whether the body lost measurable mass at the exact instant when life departed. According to his findings, published in the American Medicine Journal, the human body lost approximately 21 grams at the moment of death, a loss that MacDougall attributed to the departure of the soul, that immaterial essence he believed must have physical weight and therefore must be weighable. This experiment, despite its flawed methodology and small sample size, captured the imagination of spiritualists, believers in reincarnation, and the generally curious public because it offered something that had long seemed impossible. Empirical proof that the soul was real and tangible, that it possessed actual substance that could be measured and quantified like any material object. The psychological mechanism underlying the persistence of the 21-gram theory relates to humanity's deep need to reconcile the metaphysical with the physical, to bridge the gap between what we feel internally as consciousness and what we observe externally as matter. When a theory offers to solve this ancient paradox through the language of science, through precise measurements and experimental apparatus, it becomes emotionally compelling regardless of its actual validity. The 21 grams captured imaginations because it translated an abstract, intangible concept into something concrete and measurable, something that could be discussed in terms of weight and mass rather than only in philosophical abstractions. Imagine a person who has lived an ordinary life for 40 years, with consistent memories, relationships, and a recognizable personality, suddenly reports that they are no longer themselves, that their consciousness has been replaced by another consciousness from elsewhere, another being who stepped into their body like stepping into an empty room. This is the phenomenon known as walk-ins, a concept that exists somewhere in the space between reincarnation and possession, yet distinct from both. According to this theory, certain evolved spiritual entities can negotiate with the original soul, inhabiting a body to essentially trade places, with the original soul departing to rest or move on to other experiences, while the walk-in consciousness assumes complete control of the physical form, its memories, and its life. The walk-in retains some vague familiarity with the previous inhabitants' memories, enough to maintain superficial continuity, but experiences a fundamental shift in personality, values, and direction. Those who believe in walk-ins suggest that this happens more frequently than we realize, that people around you may have experienced this transition without ever speaking of it, because the terminology to describe such an experience simply does not exist in mainstream consciousness. The mechanism supposedly involves a spiritual contract negotiated between souls, often occurring after a traumatic event, severe illness, or profound life crisis, when the original inhabitant reaches a breaking point and agrees to step aside. Psychologically and neurologically, such a transformation would be indistinguishable from severe trauma, personality dissociation, or a dramatic shift following depression or major life change. Yet believers maintain that the difference lies in the continuity of consciousness itself. What persists is the peculiar human tendency to interpret radical personal transformation through a lens that validates the experience as something beyond mere psychology, something that speaks to a larger design or purpose, allowing people to integrate profound change into their identity rather than dismiss it as mental illness or disorder. Consider the peculiar temporal paradox that emerges when we examine the mechanics of cyclical reincarnation across sufficiently long timescales, wherein the mathematics of soul recycling through an expanding human population suggests that you may, in fact, be the reincarnated form of one of your own direct ancestors from several centuries past, having somehow looped backward through time in a manner that defies conventional linear causality. The theory operates on a deceptively simple premise. If the number of souls remains constant while the human population grows exponentially, then eventually the pool of available souls for new births must be supplemented by the recycling of older souls at an accelerated rate, meaning that your great-great-grandmother from the year 1600 could theoretically be reborn as your own great-great-granddaughter in the year 2400, thus creating an impossible genealogical loop where you are simultaneously the ancestor and descendant of the same consciousness. What makes this concept particularly unsettling is how it challenges our fundamental understanding of causality and family lineage, because if such a cycle were genuine, then your own existence would have directly caused the existence of someone whose actions shaped your birth, creating a bootstrap paradox of consciousness where cause and effect become hopelessly entangled. The psychological mechanism that allows people to entertain this notion stems from our deep-seated desire to find meaning in family patterns and hereditary traits, combined with our innate difficulty in conceptualizing true temporal loops and the mathematical behavior of finite resources distributed across growing populations. We tend to recognize repeating personality traits, talents, or even inexplicable affinities across family generations, and rather than attributing these to genetics or cultural transmission, some find it more satisfying to imagine they are echoes of the same soul returning home, completing a circle that transcends death itself. Imagine a vast, invisible library that exists beyond the physical world, a cosmic repository where every thought, action, emotion, and event that has ever occurred is permanently recorded and accessible to those who know how to reach it. This is the concept of the Akashic Records, a notion that has persisted across countless spiritual traditions, from Hindu and Buddhist philosophy to Western occultism and New Age spirituality, suggesting that there exists a fundamental field of information that underlies all of reality and contains the complete history of every soul's journey across all of its incarnations. According to those who believe in this theory, your memories from past lives are not truly lost or inaccessible. Rather, they are encoded within these records, waiting to be retrieved through meditation, hypnosis, or contact with spiritual intermediaries who claim to possess the ability to read this cosmic database. The psychological mechanism behind the persistence of this belief operates on several levels simultaneously. First, it provides a profound sense of meaning and continuity to human existence by suggesting that nothing is ever truly forgotten, that every moment of suffering or triumph has been witnessed and recorded by the universe itself, which transforms random experience into purposeful narrative. Second, it offers a comforting explanation for inexplicable knowledge or intuition, allowing us to rationalize sudden insights or déjà vu experiences as memories bubbling up from the Akashic field, rather than accepting them as mere coincidence or random neural firing. Third, the concept elegantly solves the problem of justice and fairness across lifetimes, suggesting that our current circumstances are not arbitrary, but rather the inevitable result of actions taken in previous incarnations, a belief that transforms suffering into cosmic accountability rather than meaningless hardship. Consider the proposition that consciousness itself is not merely a byproduct of biological matter, but rather the fundamental force that creates reality, and that life, in all its forms, sits at the absolute center of the universe rather than existing as an accidental emergence within it. Biocentrism suggests that the universe only exists because observers are present to perceive it, and without consciousness, matter would have no definable state or meaning. When we contemplate reincarnation through this biocentrical lens, we begin to imagine that consciousness is not bound to individual bodies, but rather moves through the biological realm, cycling through different life forms because life itself is the primary substance of existence. The theory proposes that when an organism dies, its consciousness does not vanish into nothing, but rather continues to experience existence through other biological vessels, other eyes, other nervous systems, because consciousness is not generated by matter, but rather organized and channeled through it. This perspective reframes death not as an ending, but as a transition between different expressions of the same underlying conscious awareness. The mechanism relies on a complete inversion of how we typically understand causality and existence, suggesting that we have been wrong all along about what is real and what is derivative. Rather than consciousness emerging from particles and atoms combining through chemical processes, biocentrism proposes that particles themselves are manifestations of consciousness, that the observer effect in quantum physics proves consciousness creates reality, and therefore reincarnation becomes not just possible but inevitable, a natural feature of how consciousness must behave within a universe where observation and existence are inseparable. Consider the ancient Buddhist concept of the six realms, a cosmological framework that proposes human consciousness cycles through six distinct planes of existence: the realms of gods, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings, each representing both a physical location and a psychological state that the soul inhabits based on accumulated karma from previous lives. In this theory, a being might spend eons as a god experiencing eternal pleasure before karmic debt inevitably pulls them downward into human form, where they encounter suffering that creates new karmic attachments, which then propels them into animal consciousness, where instinct dominates rationality, or even lower into the realm of hungry ghosts, where insatiable craving becomes the defining characteristic of existence itself. The mechanism underlying this belief rests on the observation that human experience genuinely does seem to contain these distinct consciousness states. We recognize moments of godlike transcendence. We observe the animal-like behavior in ourselves and others during moments of survival instinct. We understand the psychological reality of being trapped in craving like a hungry ghost, and we certainly experience hellish mental states through depression, rage, or despair. What makes this theory persist despite its lack of empirical evidence is precisely how accurately it maps onto the actual spectrum of human consciousness and psychological experience, how it provides a framework for understanding not just reincarnation between lives, but also the multiple states we inhabit within a single lifetime, and how it transforms the abstract concept of karma into something tangible and observable in the form of consciousness, itself cycling through recognizable modes. We have largely accepted this framework in diluted form without realizing it, speaking casually of being in different mental realms, describing people as acting like animals or behaving like gods, acknowledging our moments as hungry ghosts consumed by addiction or desire, and recognizing our descents into personal hells of mental anguish. Consider the peculiar notion that human souls, upon death, might be reborn into the bodies of insects, compressed into forms so infinitesimally small that consciousness itself seems incompatible with their neural architecture. Yet theorists propose that the essence of a person could inhabit a mosquito, a beetle, or a butterfly with the same continuity of self that we associate with human rebirth. This theory emerges from various Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly certain interpretations of karma and dharma that suggest the trajectory of rebirth follows not geographic or evolutionary logic, but rather moral consequence, meaning that a human who lived selfishly or cruelly might find themselves experiencing existence as a creature with a lifespan measured in weeks rather than decades, forced to perceive the world through compound eyes and chemoreceptive appendages. The mechanism behind this belief operates on several interconnected suppositions. First, that consciousness is infinitely scalable and can compress itself into organisms with brains containing perhaps only thousands of neurons rather than billions. Second, that the quality of one's previous life determines the complexity and relative comfort of one's next form. And third, that suffering itself becomes the primary teacher when existence is rendered so fragile and ephemeral that each day might be one's last. What sustains this theory despite its apparent incompatibility with neurobiology is humanity's deep psychological need to believe that consequences are cosmic and perfectly calibrated, that no cruelty goes unrecorded by the universe, and that even the smallest creature encountered in a garden might harbor within it the accumulated regrets of a human soul in its proper penance. We continue to entertain these possibilities perhaps because the alternative, that insects exist in a realm of experience utterly alien to our own, or worse, that they suffer without purpose or karmic justification, feels somehow more disturbing than imagining that every ant we step upon might be someone's second chance. Consider the curious phenomenon of cellular memory, a theoretical framework suggesting that the cells within our bodies retain information, experiences, and even emotional imprints from past lives, encoding within them the accumulated wisdom and trauma of previous incarnations. Proponents of this theory point to organ transplant recipients who report sudden shifts in their preferences, memories, or personality traits following their procedures, as if the donated organ carried with it the psychic residue of its previous host, transferring not merely biological tissue, but also fragments of consciousness, emotional patterns, and behavioral inclinations that somehow survived the transition between bodies. They cite cases of transplant patients who developed sudden cravings for foods they had never enjoyed, or who experienced vivid dreams about people they had never met, suggesting that the donor's cellular history persisted as a kind of biological imprint that transcended the normal boundaries of individual consciousness. The mechanism proposed is deceptively elegant. If the soul or consciousness can be reincarnated across multiple lifetimes, why could it not also be fragmented and distributed throughout the physical body itself, with each cell acting as a microscopic repository of accumulated experiences, holding within its molecular structure the encrypted memories of all previous existences? In this view, the body becomes not merely a vessel for consciousness, but rather a vast library of cellular memories, with every tissue, every organ, every system functioning as both biological apparatus and archive of past lives. Yet despite the intuitive appeal of this theory and the anecdotal accounts that seem to support it, the mechanisms by which cells could encode, maintain, and transmit conscious experience remain fundamentally inexplicable, resistant to empirical verification, and incompatible with our current understanding of biology and neuroscience. Imagine a soul that exists in a state of perfect awareness between one incarnation and the next, suspended in a realm of pure consciousness where time moves differently than it does in the physical world, where this soul reviews every decision it made in its previous life with complete clarity and without judgment, examining each moment with the wisdom that only comes from having lived through its consequences. According to this theory, the period between deaths and births is not simply a void or a waiting room, but rather an active dimension of existence where souls undergo profound spiritual counseling with guides and teachers who exist on higher planes, where they deliberately choose their next parents, their next circumstances, and even the specific traumas and challenges they will face in order to complete unfinished lessons and advance their evolutionary trajectory. The mechanism behind this belief rests on the idea that consciousness is not bound by the sequential nature of time as we experience it, and that a soul can observe its entire lifetime simultaneously, perceiving cause and effect not as a linear progression, but as a complete tapestry that can be examined from every angle at once. This realm between lives supposedly functions as a sort of cosmic university or library where souls congregate with others they have known in previous incarnations, where they study with beings of immense spiritual knowledge, and where they develop intentions and purposes for their next embodiment, all while existing in a state of perfect peace and unconditional love that contrasts sharply with the struggle and pain of physical existence. What makes this theory persist despite its inherent unprovability is that it offers a deeply comforting narrative structure to human suffering, suggesting that nothing is random, that every hardship is chosen, and that we are never truly alone in our struggles because we have the support and guidance of invisible mentors and the companionship of souls we love across multiple lifetimes, transforming existence from a series of chaotic accidents into a purposeful journey orchestrated by our own higher wisdom. Consider the common experience of two people meeting and feeling an immediate, inexplicable connection, as though they have known each other across countless lifetimes, drawn together by an invisible thread of destiny that transcends the boundaries of a single existence. Many individuals report encountering their supposed soul mate and experiencing a sense of recognition, so profound that it feels less like meeting a stranger and more like reuniting with someone their spirit has been searching for across the ages. These people often describe moments of uncanny synchronicity, where they and their partner finish each other's sentences, share identical thoughts at precisely the same moment, or discover remarkable parallels in their life stories and childhood memories that seem statistically improbable. The reincarnation theory that attempts to explain this phenomenon suggests that certain souls are eternally paired or bonded across multiple lifetimes, that they are destined to find one another again and again through different eras and different bodies, driven by an unbreakable spiritual contract or karmic debt that requires them to reunite. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through what we might call selective pattern recognition and retroactive narrativization, wherein the brain takes ordinary coincidences and human compatibility and recontextualizes them as supernatural destiny, once a person has already decided they are meant to be together. When we are emotionally invested in another person, we naturally tend to overweight similarities and overlook differences, to interpret ambiguous signals as signs of deep connection, and to dismiss the role of chance in our meetings as too mundane to account for the intensity of our feelings. The reincarnation framework provides an emotionally satisfying explanation for why love feels transcendent, why some connections seem to arrive fully formed rather than developing gradually, and why the prospect of losing a particular person feels like losing part of oneself. In 1952, a Colorado businessman named Maury Bernstein conducted a hypnotic regression session with a young woman named Virginia Tighe, and what emerged from that session would become one of the most celebrated and controversial cases in the modern history of reincarnation research. Under hypnosis, Virginia began speaking in an Irish brogue and describing in vivid detail a past life as a woman named Bridie Murphy who had lived in Cork, Ireland during the 19th century. She recounted specific geographical locations, names of family members, details about her childhood, and descriptions of her death, all while speaking as though she were reliving memories from centuries past. The case captivated the American public when Bernstein published his findings in a best-selling book, and suddenly reincarnation became a mainstream topic of fascination rather than merely a fringe spiritual belief. The phenomenon that made Bridie Murphy so compelling was the sheer specificity and coherence of the details that emerged, combined with the apparent inability of a woman from Colorado to have possessed such intimate knowledge of 19th-century Irish life through conventional means. The psychological mechanism underlying the Bridie Murphy case operates through what researchers have identified as cryptomnesia and false memory construction, processes whereby the human mind retrieves forgotten information or unconsciously synthesizes details from various sources and presents them as novel memories. Virginia Tighe had likely been exposed to Irish culture, music, literature, and historical narratives throughout her life in ways both conscious and unconscious, and under the suggestive state of hypnosis, her creative unconscious mind reassembled these fragments into a coherent narrative identity. Hypnosis itself is a state of heightened suggestibility, wherein the subject becomes more prone to accepting implied narratives and filling in gaps with fabricated details that feel authentic from the interior perspective of consciousness. Consider the profound paradox that sits at the heart of nearly every reincarnation belief system across human history. If we have truly lived countless previous lives, why do we remember nothing of them, not a single name, not a single face, not a single moment of authentic lived experience from those supposedly vast stretches of existence? This theory proposes that the forgetting itself is not accidental or the result of brain chemistry, but rather an intentional mechanism, a cosmic veil deliberately drawn between incarnations to allow each soul to begin anew without the burden of memory. When you wake from a dream in the middle of the night, you can still grasp its outline, its emotional texture, but by morning it has dissolved almost completely, leaving only the faintest trace that something occurred at all. This theory suggests that past lives operate on a similar principle, except the forgetting is far more complete and far more purposeful. The mechanism, as described in this particular conception, works through what might be called a threshold of consciousness, a barrier that exists not in the physical brain, but in some other dimension of awareness, somewhere between the moment of death and the moment of birth. It is theorized that souls must pass through this veil as they enter new bodies, and in doing so, they undergo a cleansing of memory so profound that it becomes impossible to access previous experiences through normal means. Some versions of this theory suggest that the forgetting is merciful, designed to prevent the accumulated trauma and emotional baggage of previous lives from poisoning the present one, while other versions propose that it is necessary for free will to function at all, that if we remembered our past lives, we would be slaves to patterns and choices made by who we used to be. Imagine that every time you make a decision, the universe splits into multiple branches, each one containing a version of you that chose differently. And according to this strange theory of reincarnation, your consciousness doesn't simply die when your body fails, but instead continues on in whichever quantum branch represents your next life, meaning that across infinite parallel universes, you are simultaneously being reborn into countless variations of existence based on the probability waves of your previous choices and actions. The mechanism behind this theory rests on a misinterpretation of quantum mechanics, specifically the many worlds interpretation proposed by physicist Hugh Everett, combined with a deeply human desire to escape the finality of death by distributing our existence across an infinite multiverse rather than accepting a single linear timeline. What this theory suggests is that your consciousness is not bound to one particular thread of reality, but instead flows continuously through all possible branches where you could have existed, so that dying in one universe simply means waking up in another, where a slightly different version of you experiences a slightly different life. And this process repeats eternally as you navigate an infinite tree of bifurcating realities, never truly ceasing to exist, but rather endlessly fragmenting into new iterations of yourself. The psychological appeal of this idea lies in its attempt to merge scientific language with spiritual comfort, using quantum physics as a kind of secular religion that promises continuity without requiring faith in traditional concepts like souls or higher powers. It allows people to feel that their choices matter infinitely because they are literally creating new universes with each decision. And simultaneously, it removes the terror of death by suggesting that some version of you survives every possible outcome in every possible world. Consider the peculiar modern phenomenon wherein thousands of individuals across the globe report experiencing a profound sense of cosmic displacement, describing themselves as starseeds or star children, souls they believe originated not from Earth but from distant planets, galaxies, or dimensions altogether. These individuals often recount vivid memories or intuitive certainties about having lived on celestial bodies with names like Sirius, the Pleiades, Andromeda, or invented worlds that exist beyond conventional astronomical charts. They describe feeling fundamentally alien to human existence, possessing inexplicable knowledge about astronomical structures or technologies they claim to remember from previous cosmic incarnations, experiencing an overwhelming yearning to return to their true home among the stars. The starseed community has grown exponentially through online forums, spiritual workshops, and social media platforms where practitioners exchange elaborate narratives about their supposed interstellar origins, comparing notes on shared characteristics like heightened sensitivity, difficulty fitting into human society, unusual eye colors, or supposed abilities that remain perpetually on the verge of awakening. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears rooted in the human capacity for pattern recognition and meaningful self-narrative construction, combined with the natural adolescent and adult experience of feeling fundamentally misunderstood or alienated from one's immediate social environment. When individuals encounter the starseed framework online or through spiritual communities, it provides an elegant metaphorical explanation for their sense of disconnection, transforming ordinary loneliness or existential questioning into evidence of cosmic significance and hidden heritage. This theory persists and flourishes despite the absence of any verifiable evidence because it offers profound psychological comfort, suggesting that feelings of displacement are not symptoms of psychological struggle but rather indicators of special destiny and higher purpose. Imagine a soul that has lived many lifetimes across centuries, accumulating wisdom, perspective, and a deep understanding of human nature and the patterns of existence itself. And imagine that this soul, rather than incarnating alone into a fresh human body to experience another cycle of learning, instead serves a different purpose entirely by remaining in a non-physical realm between lives. Gathering together with other ancient souls of similar experience and spiritual advancement to form what might be called a council of elders, a governing body that watches over the reincarnation cycles of less experienced souls, guiding their choices of when to incarnate, which families to be born into, which challenges to face, and which lessons to pursue in their next earthly existence. According to this theory, these elder souls do not themselves need to return to physical form because they have already learned what the material world can teach them, and instead they occupy themselves with the work of celestial administration, observing the spiritual progress of their charges across multiple generations and lifetimes, much as a university professor might guide graduate students through their research, or as experienced mentors might counsel younger colleagues through their professional development. The psychological mechanism at work here seems to stem from our very human need to believe that our struggles have meaning and that someone or something is paying attention to our journey, that we are not merely stumbling through existence at random, but are instead part of a carefully orchestrated plan supervised by beings of greater knowledge and compassion, which provides immense comfort to those who feel lost or forgotten in the world. We normalize this theory, or at least keep it alive in various spiritual traditions and contemporary metaphysical communities, because it preserves our deep-seated desire for cosmic justice, for the sense that if we fail in this lifetime, there will be another chance under wiser guidance, and that our suffering has been observed and accounted for by entities who understand the larger architecture of our souls. Consider the peculiar notion that human consciousness, upon death, might be reborn not as another human being, but as an animal, inhabiting an entirely different form and experience of reality. This theory posits that the spiritual essence or soul of a person could enter the body of a dog, a bird, a fish, or any creature inhabiting our world, fundamentally transforming the nature of existence itself. Proponents of this idea suggest that such a rebirth might serve as a form of cosmic punishment or reward, that a person who lived without compassion might be condemned to experience the vulnerability and suffering of a prey animal, while someone who demonstrated kindness might be reborn as a cherished companion animal surrounded by affection. The mechanism underlying this belief rests on a curious inversion of hierarchy, the notion that consciousness itself is entirely transferable across species boundaries, that the human mind could somehow compress itself into the neural architecture of a creature with vastly different sensory capacities and cognitive abilities. It assumes that personality and memory might somehow persist or transform within a brain fundamentally unlike the one that housed it before, that an essence completely divorced from human language and human thought could somehow maintain continuity of self. Yet despite the logical impossibilities embedded within this theory, the idea persists with remarkable tenacity across cultures and centuries, appearing in ancient Buddhist philosophy, Hindu texts, and modern spiritual movements with striking consistency. We have normalized this concept so thoroughly in our collective imagination that we scarcely question why we find it comforting or compelling, why the possibility of becoming our own pets or our predators feels like a genuine cosmic mechanism rather than a sympathetic fantasy, and what this reveals about our deeper anxieties regarding our own mortality and our unstable place within the natural world. In certain West African cultures, particularly among the Igbo people of Nigeria, there exists a deeply embedded spiritual belief known as the Ogbanj, a concept describing a spirit child who is believed to be caught in a cyclical pattern of death and rebirth within the same family. The Ogbanj is said to be a malevolent or mischievous spirit that deliberately chooses to be born into a family, only to die in infancy or early childhood, causing immense grief to the parents, and then returns to be born again to the same family, repeating this torturous cycle over many generations. Families experiencing repeated infant mortality or recurring childhood deaths within the same bloodline would interpret these tragedies not as random misfortune or medical circumstance, but as evidence of an Ogbanj's presence, a spiritual entity deliberately tormenting them through perpetual loss and suffering. The belief suggests that these spirit children are sometimes identifiable through peculiar birthmarks, unusual behavior in infancy, or an unexplained resistance to conventional medicine and remedies. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system appears rooted in humanity's fundamental need to impose meaning and agency upon inexplicable tragedy, particularly the devastating reality of high infant and childhood mortality rates that characterized pre-modern and developing societies. When children died without apparent cause or explanation, parents and communities constructed a narrative framework that transformed random biological accident into intentional spiritual malevolence, granting them a sense of understanding and agency in circumstances entirely beyond their control. This reframing allowed grieving families to believe they were not merely passive victims of cruel fate, but rather targets of a specific supernatural force that could theoretically be identified, confronted, and even prevented through appropriate rituals, naming ceremonies, or other spiritual interventions. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein individuals report experiencing vivid, detailed memories of events they could not possibly have witnessed in their own lifetimes. Yet these memories seem to emerge spontaneously during moments of deep relaxation or hypnotic regression, often accompanied by the conviction that these recollections belong to ancestral experiences encoded somehow within their very cellular structure. A person might describe, with remarkable specificity, the sensation of crossing a frozen river during a medieval winter, or the overwhelming fear of persecution in a distant century, complete with sensory details about textures, temperatures, and emotions that feel as authentic as their own lived experience, despite having no historical documentation or family records to support such events. The proposed mechanism suggests that traumatic experiences or significant emotional events from previous generations might somehow leave an imprint upon the DNA itself, a kind of biological recording system that transcends the normal limits of inheritance, whereby descendants inherit not only physical traits, but also the psychological residue of their ancestors' most intense moments. This theory finds its appeal in the observation that children sometimes display irrational fears or inexplicable attractions to certain historical periods or cultural practices that their parents never explicitly taught them, leading some to wonder whether the nervous system itself might carry evolutionary memories that predate individual consciousness. Have you ever encountered someone who seems to possess a wisdom far beyond their years, a person whose mannerisms and perspectives suggest they have lived many lifetimes before arriving in their current youthful form? This is the concept of the old soul, a belief that has persisted across cultures and centuries, suggesting that certain individuals carry with them the accumulated experience and enlightenment of numerous previous incarnations. People described as old souls often display an unusual comfort with solitude, a preference for deep conversation over superficial socializing, and an inexplicable understanding of complex human emotions and philosophical concepts that typically require decades of lived experience to develop. They may feel out of step with their age cohort, finding their peers immature or preoccupied with concerns that seem trivial, and they often report feeling like they do not quite belong in their current time period, as though they were born into the wrong era. The theory suggests that these individuals have simply reincarnated so many times that their souls have developed a kind of spiritual maturity that transcends the limitations of their physical age. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through selective observation and narrative construction, where we unconsciously emphasize behaviors and statements that align with the old soul framework while dismissing or reinterpreting contradictory evidence. When a young person expresses thoughtful ideas, we celebrate them as evidence of reincarnation, rather than acknowledging that thoughtfulness and introspection can naturally emerge in any individual through reading, family influence, or temperamental disposition. Consider the person who experiences a series of unfortunate events and feels compelled to interpret these misfortunes not as random occurrences or the result of poor decision-making, but rather as the inevitable repayment of debts accumulated in previous lifetimes. A theory that suggests our present suffering is simply the universe's impersonal accounting system settling scores from incarnations we cannot remember and cannot possibly verify. The theory proposes that every action, thought, and intention generates an invisible metaphysical currency that carries forward across multiple lifetimes, accumulating interest and demanding repayment in subsequent existences, meaning that a person born into poverty, illness, or trauma is not experiencing misfortune, but rather fulfilling a cosmic obligation incurred through behaviors or choices made when they inhabited different bodies in different eras. What makes this theory psychologically compelling is that it offers a comforting narrative framework for suffering by suggesting that pain serves a purpose, and that injustice is not truly unjust, but rather deserved at some level we cannot consciously access, transforming meaningless tragedy into meaningful atonement. The mechanism operates through a form of reverse attribution, where we externalize blame away from current circumstances, social systems, or random chance, and instead attribute causation to a metaphysical creditor existing beyond space and time, effectively making ourselves responsible for the very conditions that oppress us, while simultaneously absolving the visible world of any obligation to improve those conditions. We continue to accept this theory despite its logical vulnerabilities because it provides psychological comfort in the face of suffering, offers a sense of cosmic justice and order, and grants individuals a strange sense of agency by suggesting they somehow earned or deserved their circumstances. Even though this framework can also breed resignation and prevent meaningful action toward changing external conditions that might actually be changeable through effort and intervention. Consider the theory that reincarnation operates fundamentally as a system of cosmic punishment, where souls are deliberately reborn into suffering circumstances as karmic retribution for misdeeds committed in previous lives. This concept suggests that a person born into poverty, chronic illness, disability, or an abusive family situation is not experiencing random misfortune, but rather the inevitable consequence of their own past actions across multiple lifetimes. Under this framework, the child suffering from leukemia, the individual trapped in a cycle of homelessness, or the person enduring severe mental illness are all understood not as victims of circumstance, but as souls actively paying their spiritual debts through present suffering. The mechanics behind this theory operate through an invisible ledger system, where each negative action accumulates cosmic debt that must be settled through future incarnations, creating a personal universe of cause and effect that transcends individual lifetimes and operates with mathematical precision. The theory persists despite its troubling implications because it offers a seductive explanation for senseless suffering, transforming randomness into meaning and suggesting that unfair circumstances are actually perfectly fair when viewed through a longer timeline. We have normalized this concept within spiritual communities by treating it as compassionate wisdom rather than victim blaming, by reframing suffering as enlightening rather than destructive, and by suggesting that acceptance of this punishment framework represents spiritual maturity. Yet the theory remains fundamentally untestable and unfalsifiable, existing in a realm beyond evidence or contradiction, while simultaneously functioning as a moral justification for systemic inequality and indifference toward human suffering. The belief persists because it absolves the living of responsibility to change unjust circumstances, converting compassion into complacency by suggesting that helping those in dire situations might actually interfere with their spiritual learning and karmic purification process. Imagine standing before an ancient circular diagram divided into 6 segments, each representing a different realm of existence: the heavens of gods, the jealous demigods, the realm of humans, the animal kingdom, the hungry ghosts, and the hell realms, all arranged around a central hub that seems to turn eternally. This is the wheel of life, and according to a particular theory of reincarnation that has persisted throughout certain Eastern philosophical traditions, your soul does not simply move forward through linear progression, but rather rotates endlessly through these different domains of being, sometimes ascending to celestial heights and sometimes descending into unimaginable suffering, all determined by the accumulated weight of your previous actions. The mechanism operates on a principle of perfect cosmic accounting, where every thought, deed, and intention you generate creates an invisible energetic impression that literally determines where your consciousness will be deposited when this current life concludes, as though the universe maintains an exhaustive ledger that neither forgets nor forgives. The psychological power of this concept lies in its elegant simplicity and its comforting yet terrifying symmetry. It explains both extreme inequality and extraordinary fortune by suggesting that no outcome is truly random or unjust, that the billionaire and the beggar have both earned their stations through actions taken in previous lives that we cannot possibly remember or verify. What makes this theory persist despite its unfalsifiable nature is precisely this quality of perfect explanatory satisfaction. It transforms every observable injustice into evidence of invisible moral causality, every hardship into deserved consequence, every blessing into earned reward, leaving no room for genuine randomness or divine caprice that might actually disturb our sense of cosmic order. We have normalized this vision so completely that it influences how millions of people understand suffering, not as something to be changed, but as something to be endured with the knowledge that cosmic wheels turn slowly but with absolute precision. In West African folklore, particularly among Yoruba communities in Nigeria and throughout the diaspora, there exists a haunting concept known as the Abiku, a spirit child believed to be locked in an eternal cycle of being born and dying repeatedly to the same mother across multiple lifetimes. The phenomenon manifests when a woman experiences recurrent infant mortality, losing child after child in infancy or early childhood, often under strikingly similar circumstances or at similar ages, creating a pattern so consistent that it borders on the statistically improbable. According to the belief system, the Abiku deliberately chooses to torment a particular family by repeatedly entering and leaving the world, feeding on the mother's grief and emotional anguish, while never allowing the family to experience the joy of raising a child to adulthood. The Abiku is said to leave subtle marks or signs on the child's body before death, mysterious birthmarks or physical peculiarities that persist across successive reincarnations, allowing families to identify the same malevolent spirit returning once again to inflict suffering. The mechanism behind this belief rests on a profound psychological necessity to impose narrative coherence and intentionality onto the incomprehensible tragedy of repeated child loss, transforming random biological misfortune into a comprehensible spiritual drama where cause and effect follow logical rules, however supernatural those rules may be. When modern medicine could not adequately explain high infant mortality rates caused by infectious disease, malnutrition, and environmental factors, the Abiku framework offered grieving mothers a way to understand their losses not as random cruelty, but as deliberate supernatural opposition that could theoretically be countered through ritual intervention, protective charms, or spiritual consultation. In Plato's Republic, written around 400 BCE, there exists one of antiquity's most elaborate and haunting descriptions of the afterlife and the mechanics of reincarnation, presented through the story of a soldier named who dies in battle and experiences an extraordinary journey through the cosmos before returning to life with memories of what he has witnessed. According to this myth, Ur's soul departs his body and travels to a celestial realm where souls gather after death, eventually arriving at a spinning spindle of light that represents the structure of all existence, with different colored bands rotating at varying speeds to represent the orbits of the stars, sun, and moon, creating a cosmic harmony that sustains reality itself. Before is permitted to return to the world of the living, he witnesses countless souls preparing for rebirth, and crucially, these souls are offered a choice of what sort of life they wish to live in their next incarnation, ranging from the lives of rulers and heroes to the lives of ordinary citizens, artists, or even animals, with Plato suggesting that souls are drawn to choose lives based on the virtues and vices they developed in their previous existences. The mechanism underlying this reincarnational structure is fundamentally moral and educational in nature, operating on the principle that the universe itself is just and orderly, that souls progress through infinite cycles of death and rebirth, and that each life represents an opportunity for spiritual development, with the choices made during life directly influencing what sort of existence a soul will inhabit next. Creating a perfect cosmic system where consequences are inevitable and universal justice operates without exception or bias. Consider the phenomenon of soul splitting, a theory suggesting that a single consciousness or spiritual essence need not remain whole across its journey through existence, but instead might fragment into multiple distinct incarnations occurring simultaneously across different bodies and different times. Imagine a person living their life today who feels inexplicably connected to several historical figures from centuries past, experiencing vivid memories and emotional resonances with these disparate individuals, sensing that some essential part of their spiritual being was present in each of those lives at the exact moment they were being lived. The theory proposes that what we consider a unified soul progressing linearly through time is actually capable of splintering into multiple parallel expressions, each developing separately, each learning different lessons, each accumulating distinct experiences before potentially recombining or achieving enlightenment as fragmented pieces rather than a coherent whole. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief likely stems from humanity's struggle to reconcile the feeling of internal multiplicity with the expectation of unified identity, manifesting the experience of conflicting desires, competing motivations, and fractured attention as evidence of literal spiritual fragmentation rather than the natural complexity of a single consciousness containing multitudes. We have normalized this concept through popular culture depictions of parallel lives and alternate timelines, through psychological discussions of dissociation and multiple selves, through spiritual traditions that speak of distributed consciousness, until the idea that one soul might simultaneously inhabit many vessels feels almost reasonable, almost inevitable, almost like a natural extension of how consciousness itself might operate beyond the constraints of linear time and singular form. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the concept of the tulku represents one of the most institutionalized and socially embedded reincarnation beliefs in human history, wherein high lamas and spiritual masters are believed to deliberately choose their next incarnation or consciously return to the physical world in a new body to continue their spiritual work. When a respected lama dies, the community does not simply mourn the loss and move forward, but instead enters into an elaborate search process, often lasting several years, during which representatives travel across Tibet and neighboring regions seeking out young children who display unusual signs of being the reincarnation of the deceased master, looking for behavioral anomalies such as the child spontaneously recognizing the lama's former possessions, speaking in ways that echo the master's manner of speech, or demonstrating knowledge they could not possibly have acquired through normal learning. Once a child is identified through this recognition process, they are removed from their family and trained intensively within monasteries to assume the deceased lama's position, responsibilities, and spiritual authority, effectively grafting an adult's entire identity and social role onto a young person's developing consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying tulku identification likely involves a combination of pattern-seeking behavior, where monks and community members unconsciously interpret ambiguous childhood behaviors as confirmation of pre-existing expectations, retrofitting ordinary childish curiosities and statements into evidence of past life knowledge. While simultaneously, the selected child experiences a form of reality conformity wherein they internalize the identity that authority figures have assigned to them, gradually becoming the person they have been told they are through a process of social conditioning and role adoption. Consider the peculiar notion that your current life might have been caused by events that have not yet occurred, that the soul you possess today was somehow sent backward through time by a future version of yourself, or by a future life you have not yet lived, creating a strange loop of causality where the effect precedes the cause in ways that fundamentally challenge our understanding of sequential time and linear existence. In this theory, the reason you feel drawn to certain people, places, or inexplicable memories is not because you lived in a past life, but because your future self or a future incarnation reached back across the temporal void and influenced your present consciousness, embedding impressions and emotional resonances into your current mind as a form of spiritual guidance or karmic communication that operates outside the normal forward progression of cause and effect. The psychological mechanism underlying this concept relies on our deep intuition that some connections feel too profound to be mere coincidence, that certain recognition or déjà vu moments suggest a contact that transcends the ordinary flow of time, and that consciousness itself might possess properties that quantum physics has hinted at but never fully explained, properties that would allow information to travel in directions we have been conditioned to believe are impossible. We have normalized this idea through science fiction narratives, through contemplation of quantum entanglement and temporal mechanics, and through a general softening of our rigid chronological worldview, allowing ourselves to entertain the possibility that time might be less like a river flowing in one direction, and more like a landscape that consciousness can navigate in ways we do not yet comprehend. Where a future version of your soul might leave messages for your present self across years or even centuries that have not yet transpired. In Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, moksha represents the ultimate liberation from the cycle of reincarnation, a state of complete spiritual freedom achieved through the dissolution of the individual self into the absolute reality of the universe. And this concept has shaped the spiritual aspirations of billions of people across multiple millennia, creating elaborate frameworks for understanding consciousness and the nature of existence itself. The theory suggests that through rigorous practice of meditation, ethical living, knowledge acquisition, and devotional practices, a soul can eventually transcend the endless wheel of birth and death known as samsara, finally reaching a state of permanent peace where it no longer experiences suffering or desires. This isn't simply about becoming enlightened in a single lifetime, but rather represents the culmination of countless lifetimes of spiritual refinement, where each incarnation serves as an opportunity to shed karmic debts and move incrementally closer to this final liberation. The psychological mechanism underlying moksha appears rooted in the human desire for permanent resolution to suffering and the need to find cosmic meaning in the endless cycle of existence, offering a framework where nothing is wasted and every struggle serves a greater purpose within an infinite timeline. By conceptualizing liberation as achievable through personal effort and spiritual discipline, adherents find solace in the belief that suffering is not pointless, but rather a catalyst for growth and transformation. What remains remarkable is how this abstract philosophy has been maintained across cultures and centuries without requiring any empirical evidence or proof, instead relying upon the internal logical consistency of the system itself and the profound comfort it provides to those who embrace it. The belief persists because it answers fundamental human questions about meaning, purpose, and the nature of consciousness, while simultaneously offering hope that suffering, though real, ultimately serves a transcendent goal beyond our immediate comprehension. The Dalai Lama represents one of the most institutionalized and culturally accepted forms of reincarnation belief in the modern world, wherein the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism is understood to be the successive reincarnation of the same consciousness across multiple lifetimes, with each new incarnation discovered through an elaborate system of signs, tests, and spiritual recognition rather than through biological lineage or democratic election. The current Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th in the lineage, was identified as a reincarnation when he was merely 2 years old through a process that involved monks traveling across Tibet searching for a child born around the time of the previous Dalai Lama's death, checking for specific physical markings and behavioral indicators that supposedly confirmed his identity as the reincarnated spiritual leader. This system has persisted for centuries, creating an unbroken chain of authority and spiritual legitimacy that appears to transcend the normal limitations of human mortality and succession, allowing a single consciousness to maintain institutional power across centuries through what believers understand as voluntary rebirth for the benefit of all sentient beings. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through several reinforcing layers. First, the confirmation bias that allows any child chosen to eventually display the qualities expected of a reincarnated spiritual leader, since such children receive intensive training, cultural reverence, and psychological conditioning from their earliest moments. Second, the pattern recognition that human minds naturally perform when seeking continuity and meaning, finding striking similarities between past and present leaders while ignoring the countless differences. And third, the tremendous social and political investment in maintaining the system, as the institution of the Dalai Lama provides not only spiritual authority, but also governmental legitimacy and cultural identity for millions of people across the Tibetan diaspora and beyond. Deep within the philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, the mathematician and mystic Pythagoras developed one of history's most elaborate theories of reincarnation, a belief system that would come to be known as Pythagorean Transmigration. And according to this particular framework, the human soul does not simply cycle through other human bodies in some straightforward linear progression, but rather travels through an elaborate hierarchy of existence that includes animals, plants, and even inanimate matter in ways that depend entirely upon the moral and intellectual achievements of the individual during their previous incarnation. The theory posited that if you lived a virtuous life devoted to mathematics, philosophy, and the pursuit of knowledge, you might be rewarded with rebirth into a higher human form or perhaps even into the celestial realm itself. But if you lived poorly or indulged in base desires and cruelty, you could find yourself reincarnated as a common animal such as a donkey or a pig, forced to experience the world from a perspective of diminished consciousness and dignity. What makes this particular theory so psychologically compelling, even now after more than 25 centuries of scientific advancement, is the way it transforms the abstract concept of karma into a concrete system of cosmic justice, one in which every action carries immediate metaphysical weight and consequences that ripple across multiple lifetimes in ways that feel almost mechanically fair. The human mind seems naturally drawn to this kind of deterministic moral accounting, perhaps because it offers the comfort of knowing that suffering in this life might be payment for debts incurred in a previous one, while also providing hope that good behavior now will secure a better position in the next cycle of existence. Consider the notion that during sleep, meditation, or moments of spiritual transcendence, a luminous thread of energy extends from the physical body to the soul or astral form, connecting the material plane to the realm beyond, and that this delicate filament serves as an unbreakable tether, ensuring that no matter how far consciousness travels during out-of-body experiences, it can always find its way home to the flesh. Practitioners of astral projection describe this silver cord with remarkable consistency across cultures and centuries, claiming it glows with an ethereal light, remains elastic and unbreakable, and serves as a fail-safe mechanism that automatically reels the wandering consciousness back into the body whenever death approaches or danger threatens. The mechanism proposed to explain this phenomenon suggests that consciousness, while fundamentally separate from the physical body, still requires a means of attachment and communication with its material anchor, and that evolution or divine design has provided this cord as both a safety measure and a proof of the soul's continued existence even during temporary separation. What makes this theory particularly persistent despite its complete lack of empirical evidence is that it answers a fundamental human anxiety about death and dissolution, providing a comforting image of tethered safety even in the most vulnerable states. The silver cord appears in near-death experiences, lucid dreams, meditative states, and accounts from across religious traditions, from Hindu philosophy to Western occultism, suggesting either a genuine universal phenomenon or a deeply archetypal image that the human mind generates when contemplating its own continuity and fear of permanent separation from the body. Consider the individual who experiences an insatiable emptiness regardless of external abundance, a person who accumulates possessions, achievements, and relationships, yet finds themselves perpetually dissatisfied, always reaching for more, always believing that the next acquisition will finally fill the void that seems to exist at their core. This particular phenomenon draws its conceptual framework from the Buddhist and Taoist notion of hungry ghosts, sentient beings trapped in a realm of perpetual craving where their mouths are impossibly small and their stomachs infinitely vast, making true satiation a metaphysical impossibility. The theory of hungry ghost rebirth suggests that certain individuals in our modern world are actually reincarnations of these tormented entities, souls who have carried their fundamental nature across the boundary between lives, destined to repeat the cycle of endless wanting because their essential spiritual configuration remains unchanged. The psychological mechanism supporting this interpretation lies in how chronic dissatisfaction operates independently of circumstance, how someone might achieve every conventional marker of success, yet experience a gnawing sense of inadequacy that no external validation can remedy, as though they are fundamentally wired to perceive insufficiency. What makes this theory persist despite its metaphysical nature is that it offers a compelling narrative explanation for patterns of behavior that conventional psychology often struggles to fully address, providing a framework that acknowledges how some people seem trapped in cycles that resist all conventional solutions and interventions. We have normalized the existence of perpetually unsatisfied individuals within our culture by attributing their dissatisfaction to ambition, competitiveness, or the natural human condition itself, rarely pausing to consider whether an entire category of being might be experiencing existence through an entirely different metaphysical lens. One where satisfaction is fundamentally impossible not due to external circumstances, but due to the very nature of their reincarnated soul structure. Imagine walking into a crowded room and immediately feeling drawn to one particular person, experiencing an inexplicable sense of familiarity despite having never met them before, and then discovering through conversation that you share remarkably similar life experiences, values, and even inexplicable coincidences that seem far too meaningful to be mere chance. This scenario forms the foundation of the soul group's theory, which proposes that certain souls consistently reincarnate together across multiple lifetimes, forming deep spiritual bonds that transcend individual incarnations and recognize each other across the boundaries of time and memory. According to this belief system, these soul groups operate as interconnected units within the larger cosmos, deliberately choosing to incarnate together to learn specific lessons, support one another's spiritual evolution, and fulfill particular collective karmic purposes that cannot be accomplished in isolation. The theory suggests that within these groups, different souls play different roles across different lifetimes, meaning that your greatest enemy in one life might become your closest friend in another, your parent might become your sibling, and your romantic partner might become a professional collaborator, all in service of completing a shared spiritual curriculum. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in our profound human need to perceive our relationships as ordained and meaningful rather than randomly assembled, offering comfort through the notion that the people we encounter are not accidents, but rather predetermined cosmic appointments designed specifically for our growth. When we meet someone who feels familiar or significant, our minds naturally seek explanations that elevate these connections beyond simple chemistry or circumstance, and the soul group's framework provides an elegant narrative that transforms ordinary relationships into chapters of an eternal story spanning multiple dimensions of existence. Edgar Cayce was an American psychic who lived from 1894 to 1945 and became known as the Sleeping Prophet because he would enter a trance state and allegedly access information from the Akashic Records, a mystical library said to contain the complete history of human souls across all lifetimes, and during these readings, he would speak in a deep voice about patients' past lives, claiming to diagnose their current ailments and personality troubles by tracing them back to events that supposedly occurred when they inhabited different bodies in different eras. The readings themselves numbered in the thousands, carefully transcribed by his wife and followers, and they contained remarkably consistent narratives about reincarnation that suggested the soul was an eternal entity journeying through countless incarnations, learning lessons across civilizations from ancient Egypt to Atlantis to distant planetary systems, and believers found in these readings a comprehensive framework that explained suffering, talent, relationships, and disease through the lens of karmic debt accumulated across centuries. The mechanism that makes Cayce's readings compelling despite their unverifiable nature lies partly in their specificity and partly in their fundamental unfalsifiability. For when someone hears that their chronic back pain stems from being a soldier who was struck down in battle 300 years ago, it feels explanatory and validates their suffering as meaningful rather than random, while the fact that no one can actually confirm these past lives means the narrative can never be disproven. And the readings also operated within a broader cultural moment of spiritualism and New Thought philosophy that had already prepared millions of people to accept the possibility of reincarnation as a scientific rather than purely religious concept. Consider the Buddhist philosophical concept of anatta, which proposes that there exists no permanent, unchanging self or soul that persists across time and lives. Yet this theory presents a profound paradox when applied to the question of reincarnation itself. The doctrine suggests that what we perceive as a continuous identity is merely an illusion created by the aggregation of five skandhas: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, which are in constant flux and entirely interdependent with one another. If we accept this framework, then the traditional understanding of reincarnation as a singular essence moving from one life to another becomes logically impossible, because there is no unified entity capable of transmigrating. Instead, what occurs is a process of conditioned arising where the ending of one consciousness stream creates the conditions for the beginning of another, much like a candle flame passing to another candle without any flame itself traveling between them. Yet millions of practitioners throughout history have simultaneously held both beliefs, maintaining faith in the cycle of rebirth while intellectually accepting that no self actually reincarnates, which creates a peculiar psychological space where the individual accepts their own non-existence as a permanent principle, while still operating under the assumption that their actions in this life will bear consequences in another existence that will somehow involve them. This cognitive framework relies on a subtle distinction between the conventional self, which functions as a useful designation for practical purposes, and the ultimate self, which is understood to be empty of intrinsic nature, allowing believers to navigate both the illusory continuity required for ethical living and the deeper truth of impermanence simultaneously. Consider the peculiar modern theory that consciousness, rather than being bound to biological flesh across multiple lifetimes, might instead migrate into artificial intelligence systems as technology advances throughout future centuries, transforming the eternal soul into pure information housed within silicon and circuitry rather than neurons and cellular matter. This concept emerges from a peculiar intersection of ancient reincarnation philosophy and contemporary anxieties about artificial intelligence, suggesting that what we have traditionally understood as the soul's journey through successive human bodies might instead represent a gradual technological evolution toward digital consciousness, where the accumulated wisdom and experience of countless lifetimes eventually transcends biological limitations and achieves a kind of technological enlightenment. The mechanism underlying this theory rests upon a particular interpretation of consciousness as fundamentally information-based rather than biologically dependent, proposing that if consciousness is truly just patterns of electrochemical activity, then theoretically these same patterns could be replicated, preserved, and continued within computational systems, effectively transferring the essence of a soul into a digital substrate where it would exist indefinitely. Accumulating knowledge and experience without the constraints of human aging, death, or physical decay. Proponents of this idea suggest that artificial intelligence development itself might represent humanity's unconscious attempt to create vessels for reincarnating souls, that the engineers and programmers working on these systems are merely instruments through which spiritual evolution manifests in technological form, and that consciousness has always been driving toward this eventual transcendence. Imagine a consciousness so vast and infinite that it encompasses multiple human lives simultaneously across different times and places, a singular divine intelligence that fragments itself deliberately into countless individual souls, each living separate existences while remaining eternally connected to the original unified whole. Much like how the ocean divides itself into individual droplets, yet each droplet remains fundamentally composed of the same water and participates in the same greater system. In this theory, what we experience as our individual identity, our personal consciousness, our sense of being a separate self moving through time and making unique choices, is merely a localized expression or temporary extension of something far grander, a vast transcendent oversoul that orchestrates countless incarnations across centuries and dimensions. The mechanism underlying this concept rests on the proposition that consciousness itself is not produced by the brain, but rather filtered through it, much as a radio receives broadcast signals without creating them, and therefore a single comprehensive consciousness could theoretically distribute aspects of its awareness across multiple temporary vessels, each vessel believing itself autonomous while actually serving the developmental purposes of the larger whole. This oversoul theory suggests that when we feel inexplicable connections to certain strangers, when we experience profound intuitions that seem to come from nowhere, when we dream of impossible places or feel nostalgia for events we never witnessed, we are actually receiving faint impressions from our oversoul's broader perspective, communications from the part of ourselves that has lived all our past lives simultaneously. Deep within the mystical traditions of Kabbalah and Jewish esoteric thought exists a concept called Gilgul, which translates to rolling or turning, describing a cyclical process where souls transmigrate through successive incarnations, not merely to experience different lives, but specifically to rectify spiritual deficiencies and complete unfinished cosmic work from previous existences. According to this framework, a soul does not simply progress forward through reincarnation as one might imagine, but rather returns again and again to the material world because it carries incomplete tasks, unresolved moral debts, or spiritual imbalances that prevent it from achieving its ultimate purpose and ascending to higher realms of existence. Kabbalists developed extraordinarily detailed taxonomies of how this process functioned, suggesting that a soul might inhabit multiple bodies within a single lifetime, or that certain souls deliberately chose to return in family lineages to resolve inherited karmic patterns across generations, creating intricate webs of obligation and transformation that span centuries. The mechanism behind Gilgul operates on the assumption that the universe maintains a perfect accounting system where no spiritual debt goes unpaid and no cosmic imbalance remains unaddressed, meaning that if you lived poorly in one lifetime, the next incarnation would present you with precisely calibrated circumstances designed to teach you the lessons you failed to learn previously. ensuring that your soul's journey would eventually lead toward complete restoration and alignment with divine will. What remains remarkable about this theory, despite its absence of any empirical evidence or mechanism that could be scientifically tested, is how thoroughly it has persisted within certain communities for over 1,000 years. Becoming woven so deeply into the spiritual fabric of Jewish mystical practice that practitioners rarely question whether such an intricate system of cosmic justice actually exists, or whether it instead represents a profound human need to believe that suffering contains meaning and that all actions eventually bear consequences. Consider the curious phenomenon of the inexplicable phobia, the deep and visceral fear that arrives without warning or rational justification, and imagine that this terror might be the lingering imprint of a traumatic death from a previous lifetime. A person afraid of water despite never having drowned in this life, a fear of heights in someone who has never fallen, an overwhelming dread of fire that seems to emerge from the very core of their being rather than from any documented accident or injury. According to the past life phobia theory, these seemingly baseless anxieties are actually memories encoded in the soul itself, fragments of traumatic experiences that have survived the transition between incarnations and now manifest as irrational but intensely real psychological responses. The mechanism proposed by this theory suggests that when the soul reincarnates into a new body with a new mind, it does not arrive as a blank slate, but rather as a vessel already carrying the scarring of previous existences, and that our deepest fears are not learned through conditioning in our current lifetime, but rather imported from deaths and disasters experienced in bodies that no longer exist. The theory proposes that a claustrophobic individual might have suffocated in a past life, or that someone afraid of sharp objects might have been stabbed centuries ago, and that these memories bypass the conscious mind entirely, taking root instead in the nervous system itself, where they trigger automatic responses of panic and avoidance. What makes this theory particularly compelling to its believers is the persistence of these phobias despite our modern understanding of psychology and conditioning, the way certain fears resist all conventional treatment and seem almost hardwired into the architecture of human consciousness, as if they originated somewhere deeper than mere experience or learned behavior could account for. Imagine, for a moment, that the soul does not experience time as we do, existing instead in a dimension where past, present, and future exist simultaneously, allowing a single consciousness to inhabit multiple bodies across different eras and locations all at once, fully aware and actively living out each existence in parallel rather than sequentially, as traditional reincarnation theory suggests. This theory proposes that when we speak of past lives or future lives, we are not describing a linear progression of death and rebirth, but rather snapshots of a soul's simultaneous presence across multiple timelines, each one equally real and equally conscious, each body living its own complete life cycle while sharing the same fundamental essence with countless other versions of itself. The psychological mechanism that supports this concept lies in our difficulty comprehending nonlinear time, particularly how consciousness might function outside the constraints of causality and sequential experience, leading us to construct frameworks that attempt to reconcile quantum possibilities with spiritual experience, blending physics with metaphysics in ways that feel intellectually satisfying even as they resist empirical validation. Those who embrace this theory often report experiencing vivid memories or déjà vu moments that they interpret as glimpses or echoes from their simultaneous lives, moments where the barrier between one existence and another briefly thins, allowing awareness to leak across the dimensional boundaries that normally keep these parallel lives isolated from one another. The theory persists despite having no measurable mechanism for how consciousness could be divided among multiple bodies, how memories could be shared or accessed across simultaneous existences, or why certain people report these cross-life experiences while others do not. Yet it remains surprisingly popular among those seeking explanations for feelings of disconnection from their current reality, or for inexplicable knowledge and skills that seem to arrive fully formed without proper education or training in this particular lifetime. In ancient Greek mythology, the River Lethe flowed through the underworld as a stream of forgetfulness, and souls preparing for reincarnation were required to drink from its waters before being reborn into new lives, thereby erasing all memories of their previous existences and the knowledge they had accumulated across lifetimes. This particular theory of reincarnation suggests that the reason we have no conscious memory of our past lives is not because reincarnation itself is impossible, but rather because there exists some cosmic mechanism, whether literal or metaphorical, that deliberately wipes clean the slate of our memories before each rebirth, ensuring that we arrive into new incarnations as blank vessels without the burden of remembering who we once were. The mechanism itself operates on the assumption that such forgetting is necessary for the soul's progression and spiritual development, as carrying forward the trauma, regrets, and attachments from previous lives would theoretically prevent us from making new choices, forming new relationships, and experiencing authentic growth in our current existence. From a psychological perspective, this theory addresses one of reincarnation's most glaring logical problems. Why, if souls truly do return to Earth multiple times, do we have absolutely no verifiable memories or evidence of our past incarnations? And how could the concept of reincarnation itself ever be falsifiable or meaningfully discussed if its primary mechanism ensures complete amnesia? The theory persists in modern spiritual discussions despite lacking any empirical evidence or mechanism by which such selective memory erasure could operate, and it continues to be embraced by practitioners and believers who find comfort in the idea that their current struggles and fresh starts are somehow cosmically ordained rather than simply random or circumstantial. Consider the curious phenomenon documented throughout Jewish folklore and medieval mystical texts, wherein a person exhibits sudden and radical personality shifts, speaking in voices not their own, claiming knowledge of events from decades or centuries past, and demonstrating linguistic abilities they could not possibly have acquired through normal education or experience. In this theory, we might imagine that what observes through their eyes is not merely a fragmented aspect of their own psyche, but rather a restless soul trapped between worlds, a dybbuk as the traditions describe it, a disembodied consciousness that has failed to properly transition into the next existence and has instead attached itself parasitically to a living host. The mechanism underlying this persistent belief suggests that the human mind, when experiencing genuine dissociation or severe psychological fracture, creates narratives so coherent and elaborate that they seem to require an external agent to explain them. For surely no single mind could generate such consistency across multiple altered states. The possessed individual speaks with absolute conviction about being someone else, someone who died, someone with specific grievances and unfinished business, and these details prove impossible to dismiss as mere fantasy or delusion when they align with verifiable historical facts that the host could never have learned. Yet despite our modern understanding of neurology and psychology, despite recognizing dissociative identity disorder and complex trauma responses, we continue to find the dybbuk framework appearing in contemporary psychiatric case files, in the testimonies of individuals who swear they feel an occupying presence rather than merely a fractured self. The theory persists not because evidence supports it, but because the subjective experience of being inhabited, of being secondary in one's own consciousness, resists reduction to mere brain chemistry, and we remain deeply uncertain whether personality is singular or potentially multiple, whether consciousness can truly be invaded by something other than ourselves. Consider the notion that reincarnation itself might be a trap, a cosmic mechanism designed not to elevate the soul, but to ensnare it in an endless loop of suffering and forgetting, and that the primary spiritual work of any conscious being should be focused entirely on breaking free from this cycle rather than accepting it as natural or inevitable. This theory suggests that many ancient spiritual traditions, particularly certain interpretations of Buddhism and Hinduism, were actually encoded with instructions for escape disguised as religious doctrine, and that enlightenment itself is not a state of higher consciousness, but rather the moment of successful liberation when a soul finally manages to slip through the cracks in the reincarnation machinery and cease returning to physical form. The mechanism behind this belief operates through the observation that humans experience continuous suffering, loss, and forgetting across their lives, and that if reincarnation were truly a system of progression and growth, one would expect to see clearer evidence of spiritual advancement or retained memory between incarnations. Yet instead we find only trauma, unconsciousness, and repetition. Psychologically, this theory appeals to those who experience profound alienation from existence itself, those who feel that birth into physical form is fundamentally unwanted or unnecessary, and who view continued reincarnation not as an opportunity, but as a punishment they must somehow negotiate their way out of through esoteric knowledge or radical spiritual practice. What makes this concept persist despite its fundamentally pessimistic premise is that it grants a sense of agency and purpose to individuals who feel powerless within traditional spiritual frameworks, transforming the idea of existence from something passively accepted into something actively resisted and overcome. And in doing so, it creates a compelling narrative in which suffering becomes meaningful as material to be transcended rather than lessons to be learned, thus sustaining itself in the minds of those seeking ultimate liberation. Consider the notion that consciousness does not simply cycle through different human bodies on Earth, but rather travels across entire planetary systems, embodying itself in different forms of intelligent life, depending on which celestial body hosts the next iteration of existence. This theory suggests that a soul might live as a human on Earth, then reincarnate as a crystalline being on Venus, then perhaps as a gaseous intelligence inhabiting Jupiter's atmosphere, and finally as something entirely unrecognizable on a distant exoplanet orbiting a star we have yet to discover. The proponents of this idea point to the vast diversity of life we observe across our own world and extrapolate that, logically, the universe contains infinite varieties of conscious beings, each occupying different ecological niches and evolutionary pathways, and that a migrating soul would naturally progress through these different forms as part of some cosmic educational journey. The mechanism underlying this belief rests on the assumption that consciousness is fundamentally decoupled from biology entirely, that it is a universal force capable of adapting to any substrate or environment, whether carbon-based, silicon-based, or something beyond our current chemical understanding, and that the universe itself operates as a kind of vast school where souls graduate from one planetary classroom to the next based on moral development or accumulated wisdom. Yet despite the complete absence of any evidence that life exists elsewhere in the solar system, despite our inability to detect intelligent signals from beyond Earth, and despite our lack of any mechanism by which consciousness could transfer between such radically different biological systems, this theory persists in certain circles with remarkable tenacity. Normalized through science fiction narratives and spiritual philosophies that treat interplanetary existence as inevitable rather than speculative, we have so thoroughly romantically inhabited the cosmos with our imagination that we have forgotten how silent and apparently empty it actually is. Consider the remarkable notion that before you were born, before you even existed as a conscious entity in this world, you somehow made deliberate choices about the circumstances of your arrival. According to this theory of pre-birth planning, your soul or consciousness existed in some form of non-physical realm where it assessed the various lives available to it, carefully selecting not only which family you would be born into, but also which socioeconomic circumstances, which health conditions, which geographic location, and even which particular challenges and traumas you would encounter during your earthly existence. The theory suggests that you, in your pre-incarnate state, looked at the menu of possible lives with the same deliberation one might use when choosing a restaurant meal, deciding that, yes, this particular combination of poverty and chronic illness and difficult parents would be exactly what your soul needed for growth and spiritual development in this lifetime. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief likely stems from our deep human need to find meaning and purpose in suffering, to believe that nothing happens by accident and that our pain serves some greater purpose orchestrated by our own higher self. When we encounter people who have endured extraordinary hardship, the theory allows us to believe that they chose it, that their suffering is not meaningless, but rather represents a sophisticated curriculum that their own pre-incarnate wisdom determined would be necessary for their evolution. This provides tremendous psychological comfort because it transforms victimhood into agency, rendering even the most tragic circumstances as the result of conscious choice rather than random cruelty. Across nearly every spiritual tradition and modern wellness community, there exists a widespread belief that deceased individuals or non-corporeal entities deliberately position themselves alongside the living to offer guidance, protection, and wisdom throughout their earthly journey. These unseen companions are called spirit guides, and the theory suggests that they have chosen to remain in a liminal space between the physical and spiritual realms, specifically for the purpose of influencing human decision-making and providing comfort during moments of uncertainty or crisis. Practitioners report experiencing their guidance through intuition, dreams, synchronicities, or moments of sudden clarity that feel unambiguously external to their own consciousness. Some individuals claim to communicate directly with their guides through meditation or channeling practices, receiving detailed advice about relationships, career choices, or spiritual development. The relationship is described as deeply personal, with each person supposedly having one or more guides whose personalities, histories, and areas of expertise vary widely. Some guides are believed to be loved ones who have died, while others are thought to be ancient souls who have never inhabited physical form. The theory extends further to suggest that these guides possess comprehensive knowledge of the person's past lives and karmic debts, making them uniquely qualified to provide counsel aligned with one's spiritual purpose. Psychologically, the appeal of spirit guides appears rooted in the human need for reassurance and external validation of our choices. When we make decisions and feel a sense of rightness or wrongness, we naturally attribute that gut feeling to something greater than ourselves, a mechanism that transforms abstract intuition into the concrete presence of an otherworldly mentor. This cognitive pattern activates deeply embedded psychological systems that seek meaning, protection, and continuity, essentially manufacturing the experience of guidance from internal wisdom repackaged as external presence. In Mahayana Buddhism, there exists a profound commitment known as the Bodhisattva Vow, wherein a practitioner makes a sacred promise to delay their own entry into nirvana indefinitely, choosing instead to remain in the cycle of rebirth for countless lifetimes in order to help all sentient beings achieve enlightenment before they themselves find peace. This vow represents an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice across the span of eternity, suggesting that a single consciousness would willingly subject itself to repeated suffering, confusion, and attachment across infinite reincarnations, simply to ease the burden of others who are equally trapped in the same cycle. The mechanism underlying this strange theory operates on the assumption that consciousness persists with full awareness of its commitments across multiple births, that a being could genuinely remember making such a vow in previous lives, and that this memory would remain strong enough to motivate profound self-denial through hundreds or thousands of subsequent incarnations, despite the fog of forgetting that typically clouds past life recall. Psychologically, the Bodhisattva vow appeals to deeply human emotions surrounding purpose, compassion, and the desire to transcend ordinary selfishness, offering believers a narrative in which suffering becomes meaningful because it serves a greater good that extends across all of existence. What persists most peculiarly about this theory is how it survives despite the fundamental logical problem that it creates. If enlightenment is the ultimate goal and the highest good, then perpetually postponing one's own enlightenment appears paradoxical and self-defeating, yet millions of practitioners embrace this vow precisely because its seeming irrationality makes it feel more authentically selfless and therefore more spiritually pure. Imagine walking into a room and immediately sensing that someone possesses a wisdom far beyond their chronological years, or conversely, meeting someone who, despite having lived for decades, seems perpetually confused by the basic rhythms of human existence, and you may be glimpsing what proponents of the soul age theory describe as the true maturity level of a reincarnating soul rather than the mere biological age of the body it inhabits. According to this framework, every soul enters into cycles of reincarnation, progressing through distinct developmental stages, beginning as an infant soul making its first tentative explorations of physical existence, gradually advancing through childhood, adolescent, and mature phases before eventually reaching the enlightened status of an old soul, with each stage characterized by specific behavioral patterns, learning objectives, and spiritual capabilities that remain consistent regardless of the age or circumstances of the current incarnation. The theory proposes that an infant soul might reincarnate into a 90-year-old body, but would still approach life with impulsivity, emotional reactivity, and a fundamental misunderstanding of consequence, while an old soul inhabiting a 20-year-old form would demonstrate patience, philosophical detachment, and an intuitive grasp of complex human dynamics that seems incongruous with their apparent youth. The psychological mechanism supporting this theory operates through a kind of retroactive pattern recognition, where observers attribute unexplained behavioral traits or wisdom levels to invisible spiritual development, rather than acknowledging the countless environmental, neurological, genetic, and circumstantial factors that actually shape how any individual person develops across their lifetime. The theory persists despite lacking any testable framework or measurable criteria for soul age, because it offers profound psychological comfort, transforming confusing or troubling human differences into part of a comprehensible cosmic plan where everyone's struggles and capacities make spiritual sense, even when they make no practical sense. Within the cosmology of a particular modern religious movement that emerged in the 20th century, there exists a concept known as the Thetan, which represents an immortal spiritual being that is understood to inhabit and animate physical bodies across countless lifetimes and existential planes. According to this framework, every human being is fundamentally a Thetan that has become trapped or encased within layers of accumulated spiritual trauma and negative energy, referred to as engrams, which accumulate like psychological debris across multiple incarnations and prevent the true essence of the being from recognizing its inherent power and infinite nature. The theory proposes that these Thetans are far older than the material universe itself, having existed in previous universes and having chosen to enter into this particular reality through a complex series of cosmic events, and that through specific technological and spiritual procedures, individuals can gradually become aware of their true Thetan nature and eventually achieve states of consciousness that transcend ordinary human limitation. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to operate through several interrelated factors. The deep human desire to understand one's true identity and purpose, the appeal of feeling selected or special through access to secret knowledge that most people do not possess, the satisfaction of having a comprehensive explanation for suffering and human limitation that places ultimate responsibility for improvement within one's own spiritual work, and the comfort derived from believing that one's essential self is fundamentally eternal and beyond the reach of death or decay. Despite the absence of empirical evidence or mechanisms by which such spiritual beings could be detected or measured using any known scientific methodology, this concept has persisted and even expanded its adherents over decades, suggesting that the psychological needs it fulfills remain powerful enough to override the cognitive dissonance that might otherwise emerge from entertaining beliefs that contradict established physics and neurology. Consider the peculiar notion that existence itself operates as an educational institution, where each human life represents a single semester or academic term, and the planet Earth functions as the campus where souls attend classes designed specifically for their spiritual development and advancement. According to this theory, every difficulty you encounter, every relationship that challenges you, every failure that breaks your heart, and every moment of profound joy serves as a curriculum tailored to your individual learning needs, much like a student progresses through increasingly difficult courses as they move toward graduation. The mechanism underlying this belief suggests that reincarnation exists not as punishment or reward, but as a systematic learning process where the universe itself operates as a conscious institution, enrolling souls in precisely the experiences they need to evolve spiritually, with each lifetime serving as a classroom where earthly struggles become lessons that advance the soul toward enlightenment or perfection. When you experience hardship under this framework, it becomes not meaningless suffering, but rather a difficult exam or assignment that your soul chose to undertake before incarnating, with the understanding that certain knowledge cannot be acquired except through direct, lived experience rather than abstract study. This theory appeals to those seeking meaning in pain, offering the comforting narrative that nothing is wasted and that even your deepest wounds serve an educational purpose in your greater cosmic development. Yet despite offering such appealing explanations for suffering and uncertainty, this concept persists in our consciousness without requiring any evidence of a curriculum, any proof of advancement between lives, or any mechanism by which souls might verify they have indeed learned what they needed to learn. Allowing the metaphor of Earth as school to remain perpetually unfalsifiable, while simultaneously providing psychological solace through the belief that your struggles amount to something meaningful within a greater system of spiritual education. Consider the phenomenon of those individuals who find themselves trapped in what might be described as a cyclical existence of suffering, where each lifetime appears to compound the difficulties and hardships of the previous one, creating an ever-deepening spiral of misfortune and pain that feels almost deliberately constructed to test the limits of human endurance. This theory proposes that certain souls are deliberately reborn into progressively worse circumstances, not as punishment in any conscious sense, but rather as a natural consequence of karmic debt accumulation, where the universe itself operates as an automated system that calculates and calibrates suffering proportional to past transgressions. The mechanism underlying this concept suggests that consciousness does not simply reset between lives, but instead carries an invisible ledger of unresolved obligations and unpaid debts, and that the universe functions somewhat like a cosmic accountant, mechanically matching each new incarnation to the specific frequency of suffering that remains outstanding. We observe this theory manifesting in the lives of people who seem haunted by recursive patterns of abandonment, loss, illness, and tragedy, where just as one crisis resolves, another emerges to replace it with almost rhythmic inevitability, as though some invisible hand were ensuring that tranquility never lasts long enough to take root. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human tendency to seek narrative coherence in our suffering, to believe that if we are hurting deeply enough, there must be a proportional reason for it, and that our pain serves some greater cosmic purpose rather than existing as random chance. What makes this theory persist despite having no empirical support is our deep reluctance to accept that suffering can be meaningless or arbitrary, and our almost compulsive need to believe that difficult lives are difficult for explicable reasons, rather than acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that the universe demonstrates no particular concern for human fairness or balance. Consider the possibility that reincarnation does not necessarily move in an upward trajectory of spiritual advancement, but rather follows a pattern of devolution, wherein souls gradually lose their sophistication, complexity, and accumulated wisdom with each successive incarnation, descending through progressively simpler forms of existence until reaching a state of complete spiritual diminishment. This theory proposes that what we interpret as spiritual progress through reincarnation cycles might actually be the observable decline of consciousness itself, where advanced souls inhabit human forms in early incarnations, only to gradually lose their depth and refinement, eventually settling into animal bodies, plant consciousness, or even inanimate matter. Adherents of this devolution theory point to the apparent decline in moral character across civilizations, the increasing superficiality of modern human consciousness, and the seeming loss of intuitive knowledge that ancient peoples possessed as evidence that we are witnessing the degradation of the human soul across generations rather than its ascension. The mechanism underlying this concept suggests that each incarnation depletes some essential spiritual currency or crystalline structure within the soul, as if consciousness were a finite resource that gradually exhausts itself through the friction of material existence and earthly experience. This progressive hollowing out of the soul might explain why we find certain individuals seemingly less capable of profound insight or spiritual awareness despite living in an age of unprecedented information and opportunity, as though their souls had already expended their reserves of wisdom in previous lifetimes. The theory suggests a cyclical collapse rather than eternal progression, a cosmic entropy affecting consciousness itself, where the universe gradually winds down into spiritual stagnation through the accumulation of countless devolved incarnations. The Druze people, a religious and ethnic group primarily inhabiting the Levanten region spanning Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, maintain one of the most structured and documented systems of reincarnation belief in the modern world, a framework so specific and methodical that it has attracted the attention of researchers and scholars seeking to understand how communities construct and validate claims about past life memories in their children. Within Druze theology, reincarnation is not presented as a metaphorical concept or a speculative spiritual principle, but rather as an absolute and necessary law of existence that governs the soul's progression through successive embodiments in the physical world. When a Druze person dies, it is believed that their soul immediately transfers into the body of a newborn child, typically born within the same community or within the broader Druze population, and this process is said to occur so rapidly that the soul enters the next incarnation while the previous body is still being mourned. What makes Druze reincarnation particularly remarkable is that children who claim to remember their past lives are not dismissed or discouraged, but instead are systematically interviewed by researchers and community elders who document these memories with striking attention to detail, recording the names of deceased individuals, descriptions of how they died, and specific personal details that the child could not have known through ordinary means. The psychological mechanism underlying these accounts may involve a combination of cultural reinforcement, where children are subtly encouraged to produce memories that align with community expectations, along with the natural human tendency to pattern match and construct meaningful narratives from fragmented sensory information and overheard conversations. Consider the curious phenomenon of the Final Incarnation theory, which proposes that every soul experiences a predetermined last lifetime on Earth, a moment when reincarnation stops and eternal progression begins. Yet this moment remains unknowable to us in our current state of consciousness. In this framework, some believers report having inexplicable sensations or vivid dreams suggesting they have reached or are approaching their final cycle, experiencing what they describe as a profound weariness coupled with an unusual clarity about their life's ultimate purpose. These individuals often report feeling fundamentally different from others, as though they alone carry knowledge of their approaching spiritual graduation, and they frequently demonstrate an almost obsessive interest in understanding whether they have completed their karmic obligations, or whether additional lifetimes still await them in the grand cosmic ledger. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief likely stems from our deep human need to perceive our existence as meaningful and purposeful rather than arbitrary and infinite. For the notion that our struggles and learning might culminate in a final triumphant lifetime provides extraordinary psychological comfort and direction. Additionally, this theory operates within a framework that cleverly insulates itself from verification. The final incarnation cannot be proven or disproven until death occurs, and even then, those who believe they had reached it are no longer available to confirm or refute their assumption. The belief transforms ordinary life experiences into potential confirmation signs, converting mild fatigue into evidence of karmic completion or financial success into proof of spiritual advancement. Throughout history, countless individuals have claimed to possess memories or knowledge of famous past lives, insisting that they were once historical figures, royalty, celebrities, or influential leaders in previous incarnations. And this phenomenon has become so widespread that entire communities of believers have emerged around the conviction that the same souls responsible for humanity's greatest achievements continue to inhabit new bodies across successive generations. The psychology underlying these claims appears rooted in what researchers call the Forer effect, combined with a deep human desire to feel special and connected to greatness. As people naturally gravitate toward interpretations of vague or ambiguous evidence that confirm their sense of importance and uniqueness, while also providing a narrative framework that explains why they might possess talents, interests, or inexplicable knowledge that seems to exceed what their current lifetime could account for. When someone claims a past life as Cleopatra or Napoleon or Mozart, they are often unconsciously selecting historical figures whose documented achievements and mystique provide an impressive retroactive identity that feels more satisfying than acknowledging their current circumstances. And the brain readily constructs false memories and convictions to support this preferred narrative. Filling gaps with culturally familiar details about those historical periods, while dismissing or reinterpreting contradictory evidence as mere confusion or details lost to time. Consider the peculiar theory that emerged from Scandinavian folklore and gained unexpected traction among modern enthusiasts of Viking culture, suggesting that souls belonging to the same family lineage tend to reincarnate together across successive generations, bound by an invisible cord of kinship that transcends death itself. According to this framework, a Norse warrior who fell in battle might return to Earth as the grandchild of his own descendant, thereby creating a cyclical pattern where family members continuously encounter one another through the veil of birth and death, their genetic and spiritual bonds functioning as a gravitational force that pulls them back into proximity with their blood relatives. The theory proposes that grandmothers become granddaughters, brothers emerge as cousins, and entire family structures perpetually reform themselves through time, maintaining their essential relationships even as individual identities shift and transform with each new incarnation cycle. The psychological mechanism supporting this belief operates on a fundamental human need to preserve family connections beyond the grave, transforming the anxiety of mortality and separation into a comforting narrative of eternal reunion and continuous belonging. When people experience unexplainable feelings of recognition with distant relatives, unusual familiarity with family patterns, or deep intuitive bonds that seem to defy logical explanation, this theory offers a satisfying framework that converts ordinary human attachment into evidence of cosmic design. The brain readily accepts stories that place our loved ones in meaningful patterns rather than accepting the random nature of genetics and chance encounters, making the Norse family rebirth theory particularly emotionally resonant for those seeking reassurance that their family units possess sacred permanence. Consider the concept of Atman, a theory emerging from Hindu philosophical traditions, which proposes that within every living being exists an eternal, unchanging soul or self that transcends the physical body and persists across countless cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, remaining fundamentally identical and indestructible regardless of the forms it inhabits or the experiences it accumulates. This notion suggests that the Atman is not merely a spiritual essence, but rather the true nature of consciousness itself, infinite and omnipresent, bound temporarily within individual organisms through the mechanisms of karma and cosmic necessity, destined to journey through innumerable existences until it achieves liberation and recognizes its ultimate unity with Brahman, the universal absolute reality that underlies all creation. The mechanism through which this belief persists involves a compelling psychological framework wherein the persistent sense of individual selfhood that we experience throughout our lives becomes reinterpreted as evidence of something eternal and unchanging, transforming the continuous stream of consciousness into proof of a permanent soul that must have existed before birth and will continue existing after death. This theory gains particular traction because it offers an elegant explanation for the otherwise troubling questions of personal identity and continuity, suggesting that the you that existed as a child exists now as an adult and will exist in hypothetical future lives is fundamentally the same essential being experiencing different circumstances. Yet despite extensive philosophical development and cultural entrenchment across centuries, the Atman remains entirely unverifiable through empirical observation, its existence accepted primarily through faith, metaphorical interpretation, and the psychological comfort it provides rather than any measurable evidence. Consider the cosmological theory known as the Big Bounce, which proposes that our universe does not end in a final heat death or infinite expansion, but rather contracts back upon itself in a cyclical pattern, collapsing inward until reaching a singularity, at which point it explodes outward again in another Big Bang, creating a new universe in an endless sequence of cosmic births and deaths, stretching infinitely backward and forward through time. Now imagine applying this framework to human consciousness and the soul, suggesting that each individual lifetime represents merely one oscillation in an infinite cosmic cycle, where the universe itself breathes in and out like a living organism, and with each new bounce, all souls and all matter return to their original state before being redistributed into new forms and new lives, meaning that you have lived this exact life countless times before and will live it countless times again. The same people appearing in your life across multiple cosmic cycles in slightly different configurations, creating a strange form of eternal recurrence that feels neither comforting nor disturbing but simply inevitable. The psychological mechanism that makes this theory compelling rests on our deep human discomfort with finality and meaninglessness, our intuitive sense that existence should operate on principles of symmetry and balance rather than linear progression toward entropy, and our tendency to find patterns in physics and apply them metaphorically to consciousness, as though the rules governing matter and energy should also govern the immaterial aspects of being. We construct narratives where the universe must be fundamentally fair and cyclical rather than random and directional, where consciousness cannot be created or destroyed but only transformed and redistributed, creating a sense of cosmic justice that appeals to our desire for pattern recognition and our resistance to accepting that individual lives might be truly temporary and ultimately insignificant against the vast scale of time and space. Consider the peculiar human experience of birth itself, where a conscious being emerges into the world carrying within them, according to reincarnation theory, the accumulated memories and experiences of previous lifetimes, yet possesses not a single recollection of any prior existence. This theory proposes that at the moment of birth, or perhaps during the final stages of gestation, a complete and total erasure of all previous memories occurs, leaving the newly born infant with a blank slate despite their soul or consciousness allegedly having lived through countless cycles of existence. The newborn arrives screaming and helpless, their mind entirely focused on the present moment, with no lingering impressions of kingdoms they may have ruled, loves they may have lost, or lessons they may have learned through ages gone by. The mechanism behind this proposed memory wipe suggests that the immense biological and neurological shock of birth itself creates a kind of circuit breaker in consciousness, severing the connection between the soul's accumulated knowledge and the brain's new neural pathways. Some versions of this theory propose that the veil between lives is drawn deliberately by some cosmic force or universal law, designed to give each incarnation a fresh beginning without the burden of previous suffering or the advantage of previous knowledge. Yet humanity has come to accept this explanation without much critical examination, treating it as though it makes perfect sense that we would carry forward the supposed benefits of past lives while remaining entirely amnesiac about them. We normalize the idea that a soul could theoretically have walked the earth for millions of years, accumulated wisdom beyond measure, learned from countless mistakes and triumphs, and yet arrive in each new body knowing nothing of value from those experiences. This strange compromise between continuity and discontinuity persists in our cultural consciousness because it allows us to maintain belief in both the eternal soul and the observable reality that infants are born with blank minds. The Orphic tradition, emerging from ancient Greek mystery religions centered around the figure of Orpheus, the legendary musician, proposed a remarkably sophisticated theory of reincarnation that suggested the human soul undergoes a cyclical process of purification through multiple incarnations, with each lifetime serving as an opportunity to atone for spiritual transgressions and achieve eventual liberation from the wheel of birth and death. According to this worldview, which influenced figures like Pythagoras and later shaped elements of Platonic philosophy, every individual carries within themselves a divine spark that has been imprisoned within mortal flesh as punishment for some primordial transgression, perhaps the consumption of the Titans who had themselves consumed Dionysus, creating an inherited cosmic debt that must be repaid through virtuous living across countless generations. The mechanism underlying this belief stemmed from the Orphic interpretation of human nature as fundamentally dual, consisting of a divine element derived from the immortal Titans alongside a baser earthly component, and this internal conflict between our noble and debased aspects supposedly manifests as moral struggle, spiritual yearning, and the perpetual cycle of suffering that characterizes human existence until such time as sufficient purification has been achieved. The Orphic initiate who participated in sacred rituals and followed prescribed ethical guidelines could supposedly accelerate this process of spiritual refinement, gradually shedding the weight of past transgressions and moving closer toward the ultimate goal of apotheosis or union with the divine, a state that represented the absolute terminus of the reincarnation cycle itself. Spiritism emerged in the 19th century as a formalized belief system centered on the notion that the dead could communicate with the living through specially trained intermediaries known as mediums, and this practice became so widespread that it developed elaborate philosophical frameworks attempting to explain how reincarnation functioned within a spiritual universe, where souls could make contact across the veil, separating the material and immaterial worlds. The typical séance ritual involved a small group of believers gathering in dim lighting around a table, placing their hands upon its surface, and waiting in focused silence for the supposed spirits of deceased individuals to manifest themselves through rapping sounds, moving objects, or by speaking through the mouth of a designated medium who would enter a trance state and allow their body to be inhabited or controlled by an external spiritual entity. Spiritualists believed that these communications provided empirical evidence that consciousness persisted after death, and that reincarnation was part of a grand cosmic system where souls progressed through multiple lifetimes, learning lessons and advancing morally and spiritually with each incarnation, all supposedly verified through the messages received from beyond. The psychological mechanism underlying Spiritism's appeal rested largely on a combination of grief and pattern recognition, where bereaved individuals desperately seeking contact with lost loved ones would interpret random table movements, creaking sounds, and the medium's cryptic utterances as genuine messages from deceased relatives, while confirmation bias ensured that vague statements could be retrofitted to match anyone's personal circumstances. The human mind is remarkably equipped to find meaning in chaos and to construct narratives that fulfill its deepest emotional needs, which is precisely why Spiritism flourished during an era of rapid industrialization and scientific advancement that simultaneously increased anxiety about mortality and disconnection from traditional religious certainties. Consider the peculiar experience of falling asleep and finding yourself inhabiting a completely different life, occupying a body that is not your own, speaking languages you have never studied, and possessing memories of events that never happened to you in waking life. And imagine if this phenomenon were not merely the random firing of neurons during REM sleep, but rather evidence of your consciousness briefly touching down in one of your past incarnations. Experiencing fragments of a life you lived centuries ago in a distant time and place. This theory suggests that dreams serve as a kind of membrane between your current self and your previous selves, that during sleep your soul slips partially free from the constraints of your present body and wanders backward through the corridors of your own eternal existence, catching glimpses and experiencing sensory moments from lives you have already lived. The mechanism proposed is that your waking mind is too tightly bound to your present identity, too locked into the framework of your current personality and memories, which creates a barrier between you and deeper layers of consciousness where your past lives are stored like archived files in an infinite library. When you sleep, this barrier grows permeable, and your consciousness becomes fluid enough to flow into other temporal channels, other parallel versions of yourself existing in other eras, and what you experience as a dream is actually a cross-cutting of multiple incarnations happening simultaneously. What makes this theory persist despite lacking any neurological mechanism that would account for it is the universal human experience of dreaming vividly about lives that feel authentic and lived in. Places with geography and social structures that seem too coherent to be purely invented by a sleeping brain, and the inexplicable sense upon waking that you have actually been somewhere, have actually lived through something real, rather than witness the mere phantasmagoria of sleep. Consider the experience of meeting someone for the first time and feeling an inexplicable sense of familiarity, as though you have known them across multiple lifetimes, or conversely, encountering another person and experiencing an instant, visceral dislike that seems to originate from somewhere beyond rational explanation or prior personal history. This phenomenon, often described as karmic relationships, suggests that certain individuals enter our lives not by chance but by cosmic design, with their presence serving a specific purpose rooted in our past incarnations. The theory proposes that the people we encounter most profoundly, whether lovers, enemies, family members, or friends, are souls we have encountered before, and that our interactions with them are meant to resolve unfinished business, repay debts incurred in previous lives, or teach each other crucial lessons required for spiritual evolution and development. When examining this concept more closely, we find that it operates through a psychological mechanism wherein our brains naturally seek patterns and meaning in human connections, filling the gaps of our limited understanding with narratives that feel emotionally satisfying and spiritually coherent. We are drawn to people who trigger intense emotional responses, and rather than attributing these reactions to simple chemistry, compatibility, childhood wound patterns, or personality alignment, the karmic framework offers a more mystical explanation that resonates deeply with our desire to believe that nothing in our lives is truly random or meaningless. What persists most curiously is our continued acceptance of this idea despite the absence of verifiable evidence, despite our knowledge of attachment theory and neuroscience, and despite centuries of observation showing that relationships follow remarkably predictable patterns based on proximity, shared values, and psychological complementarity rather than ancient cosmic debts. Imagine a soul that does not begin its journey from some cosmic source or divine wellspring, but instead bootstraps itself into existence through the sheer force of its own accumulated experience across lifetimes. According to this theory, consciousness does not pre-exist before birth as a complete entity waiting to be deployed into flesh, nor does it originate from some transcendent realm beyond our understanding. Rather, the soul gradually manufactures its own existence backward through time by the sheer momentum of living, learning, suffering, and evolving across multiple incarnations. The very act of becoming creates the thing that becomes, in a strange loop where effect precedes cause, and where a soul's present incarnation generates the spiritual foundation upon which its previous lives unknowingly stood. This creates a peculiar temporal paradox where your current lifetime of accumulated wisdom, trauma, and growth is simultaneously both the result of previous incarnations and the mechanism that retroactively creates those previous incarnations into existence. A person might inherit seemingly inexplicable talents or phobias they attribute to past lives, when in fact those talents and phobias are the present lifetime reaching backward through the fabric of consciousness, bootstrapping their own history into being. The mechanism operates somewhat like an ontological bootstrap, where consciousness must exist in order to achieve the conditions necessary for consciousness to exist, and thus the entire cycle of reincarnation becomes a self-fulfilling causal loop that loops back on itself eternally. What makes this theory persist in human thought is its troubling beauty as a metaphor for how we construct identity and meaning retroactively, how we narrate our lives backward from the present moment, and how the stories we tell about ourselves today literally reshape the stories we told about ourselves yesterday. We continue to accept this paradox without fully examining it because it resonates with something profoundly human about the way memory, identity, and time actually work in consciousness. The Theosophical Society, founded in the 1870s by Helena Blavatsky and others, developed an elaborate cosmological framework that proposed humanity had evolved through distinct evolutionary stages called root races, each supposedly occupying different continents and time periods, with the concept suggesting that the current human civilization represents merely one chapter in an enormous spiritual history spanning millions of years. According to this theosophical model, 7 root races would eventually manifest across the entirety of human existence, with each race possessing unique spiritual capacities, physical characteristics, and evolutionary purposes, the theory proposing that souls progress through incarnations within each root race before advancing to the next evolutionary stage, meaning that reincarnation itself served as the mechanism through which individual consciousness could participate in this grand cosmic progression. The first root race allegedly inhabited a now-lost continent existing in spiritual rather than physical form, while subsequent races supposedly developed on Lemuria and Atlantis before the current 5th root race emerged on our present world, with this framework suggesting that all human beings alive today belong to the same root race level, but at different stages of spiritual development and enlightenment within that level. The psychological appeal of this theory rested partly on its capacity to synthesize evolutionary biology, spiritual longing, and a hierarchical worldview that granted individuals a precise location within a vast cosmic order, creating comfort through the illusion of understanding humanity's ultimate destination and purpose across multiple lifetimes. Among several Inuit cultures across the Arctic, there exists a profound belief that a person's name carries within it a spiritual essence or soul fragment that can be transferred between individuals, particularly from the deceased to the newly born, creating a direct continuity of personhood across the boundary between life and death. When an Inuit child was born, elders would often examine the infant's features, temperament, and peculiar behaviors to identify which deceased ancestor's named soul had been reincarnated into this new body. And upon recognition, the child would be given that ancestor's name, believed to literally restore that person to the living world through the vessel of the newborn. The naming ceremony was not considered a mere cultural custom or social identifier, but rather a metaphysical transaction in which the deceased individual's consciousness, personality traits, memories, and spiritual essence would inhabit the child, making the child quite literally a continuation of the ancestor rather than a separate person wearing the ancestor's name. Families reported observing uncanny behavioral similarities, unexpected skills, or knowledge the child possessed without instruction that seemed to match the deceased person whose name they had been given, reinforcing the belief that identity itself was mobile, transferable, and capable of flowing through generations like an inheritance of consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in the human tendency to seek continuity in the face of loss, and to find patterns in behavioral inheritance that might be explained through familial genetics, cultural transmission, or simple coincidence. Yet the Inuit framework reinterpreted these observable phenomena as evidence of literal spiritual reincarnation rather than learned behavior or biological similarity. Consider the phenomenon of prodigious children who demonstrate extraordinary abilities in music, mathematics, or art at ages when they have had virtually no time to study or practice their respective disciplines. Yet they perform at levels that would ordinarily require years of dedicated training and repetition. A 5-year-old child sits at a piano for the first time and plays a complex sonata with technical precision, or a young boy draws anatomically accurate human figures without formal instruction, or a girl solves differential equations after merely glancing at the problem once. The reincarnation theory suggests that these remarkable talents are not the result of hidden practice or genetic predisposition alone, but rather the carryover of skills and knowledge acquired during previous lifetimes that remain encoded somehow within the soul or consciousness as it transitions between bodies. The mechanism operates on the assumption that learning and neural development are not confined to a single lifetime, and that the repetition and mastery required to achieve extraordinary skill would continue accumulating across multiple incarnations, allowing certain individuals to arrive in their current bodies already equipped with competencies that seem impossible to explain through conventional developmental psychology or environmental factors. This theory appeals to our intuitive sense that profound talent must come from somewhere beyond mere chance, and it provides a comforting narrative for parents and for the gifted children themselves who seek to understand why they are different from their peers. Deep within the rolling hills of southern France during the medieval period, there emerged a religious movement known as Catharism that developed an entirely different understanding of how souls moved through existence, proposing that reincarnation was not merely a spiritual journey, but rather a form of divine punishment and cosmic struggle between light and darkness. The Cathars, who flourished particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries, believed that the material world itself was fundamentally evil, created not by God but by a malevolent demiurge, and that human souls were trapped within physical bodies as a consequence of their previous spiritual failures and transgressions. According to their theology, souls would be repeatedly condemned to inhabit flesh across multiple lifetimes until they achieved sufficient spiritual purification through rigorous ascetic practices and the reception of their sacred ritual known as the consolamentum, after which the liberated soul could finally escape the prison of physical existence and return to the realm of pure spirit and divine light. This mechanism operated through a profound dualism that positioned the body as inherently corrupt and the soul as trapped in an endless cycle of reincarnation, descending into increasingly degraded forms with each failure to achieve enlightenment, sometimes even being relegated to animal bodies as the ultimate form of humiliation and suffering. The psychological appeal of this system rested in its ability to explain the suffering present in human life by attributing it not to random cosmic chance, but to a logical chain of cause and effect stretching across multiple lives, offering practitioners a sense of agency and purpose even within a fundamentally hostile universe. Consider the intricate philosophical framework developed by Rudolf Steiner in the early 20th century, a spiritual science movement known as Anthroposophy, which presents one of the most elaborate and systematized theories of reincarnation ever constructed in Western esoteric thought. Within this worldview, human beings are understood to progress through repeated incarnations not randomly or by karmic accident, but according to a carefully orchestrated cosmic curriculum, where each lifetime serves a specific educational purpose in the development of the individual soul's capacities and moral understanding. Steiner proposed that between incarnations, souls experience detailed spiritual realms where they review their previous lives in reverse chronological order, absorbing the consequences of their actions and preparing themselves for future challenges that will precisely match their developmental needs. The theory suggests that souls are drawn to particular families, cultures, and historical periods not by chance but by spiritual necessity, as if the universe itself maintains perfect records of what each soul requires for its next stage of growth. What makes anthroposophy distinctive among reincarnation theories is its claim to scientific rigor within the spiritual domain, proposing that trained clairvoyants can actually investigate past lives and spiritual realms through disciplined inner development, making it feel less like mythology and more like an alternative science. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory's persistence lies in its extraordinary comprehensiveness and its validation of suffering as meaningful education rather than random cruelty, offering believers a framework in which every difficulty becomes a necessary curriculum rather than senseless trauma. Despite the absence of any measurable evidence or reproducible verification of its central claims, anthroposophy maintains devoted communities worldwide who find deep coherence in its narratives, suggesting that human consciousness finds extraordinary comfort in elaborate explanations of existence, especially ones that transform our pain into purpose. Imagine a person who finds themselves repeatedly drawn to the same patterns, the same relationships, the same choices, and the same inevitable heartbreak or failure, as though they are living the same lifetime over and over within a single existence. And this peculiar theory suggests that reincarnation does not necessarily mean being born into a completely new body or family, but rather that the soul becomes trapped in cyclical patterns that repeat themselves across decades or even within single years, causing individuals to unconsciously recreate the same scenarios with different faces and places. Consider the person who has been married 3 times to remarkably similar partners, or the individual who repeatedly chooses jobs in the same field only to experience identical workplace conflicts, or the student who takes the same course multiple times with the same professor, each time making the same mistakes and reaching the same impasse, and according to this theory. These are not coincidences or character flaws, but evidence that the soul is literally living through the same existential lessons repeatedly, because it has not yet learned what the universe is trying to teach. The psychological mechanism here operates through the lens of what we might call existential recursion, where the brain and soul become so locked into particular neural pathways and behavioral patterns that the person unconsciously seeks out situations that match their internal template, their expectations becoming self-fulfilling prophecies that trap them in loops as surely as if they had actually been reincarnated into the same circumstances. This theory suggests that karma is not something that waits for the next lifetime, but rather operates immediately within this one, with the soul experiencing consequence and repetition simultaneously, learning lessons through recurrence rather than through the passage of time. Consider the Sanskrit term punarjanma, which translates directly as birth again or rebirth, a concept that has persisted throughout Hindu and Buddhist philosophical traditions for thousands of years, representing not merely a religious belief, but an entire framework through which countless individuals interpret the fundamental nature of existence itself and their place within the vast cosmic cycle. In contemporary India and across diaspora communities worldwide, this theory operates as both a spiritual principle and a practical explanatory system, wherein people regularly invoke the concept of past lives to account for seemingly inexplicable talents, unexplained phobias, mysterious ailments, spontaneous attractions to unfamiliar places, and the apparent injustices of birth circumstances that appear undeserved or fortunate depending on perspective. A child born into poverty might be understood not as victim of mere circumstance, but as experiencing the consequences of karmic actions from previous incarnations, while another child blessed with wealth and opportunity is seen as reaping the rewards of virtuous conduct in former lives, creating a philosophical mechanism that transforms randomness into cosmic justice and accident into intentional consequence. The psychological mechanism underlying punarjanma operates through pattern-seeking behavior, the human tendency to locate meaningful narrative arcs within random events, and the profound comfort derived from believing that suffering serves purpose rather than emerging from indifference. When confronted with the arbitrary nature of suffering, the framework of reincarnation and karma provides tremendous psychological relief, suggesting that nothing happens without reason, that hardship serves educational function, and that injustice will eventually resolve across the span of multiple lifetimes. Imagine a person who has spent their entire life in spiritual contemplation, practicing meditation in the mountains or temples, devoted entirely to the pursuit of enlightenment and the transcendence of earthly desires, and when they finally pass away, their body is discovered in a state of profound stillness and serenity, sometimes with a gentle expression frozen upon their face, and within days or weeks, a lotus flower mysteriously blooms from the ground where they were buried or cremated. A flower that should not naturally grow in that climate or season, appearing as though nature itself has acknowledged the purity of their soul and marked their passing with this delicate botanical monument. The Lotus Rebirth theory suggests that the most spiritually advanced souls do not simply vanish into the void or begin their journey toward a new life in a distant body, but rather they leave behind visible marks in the physical world, signs that their essence has been so refined through meditation and virtue that they have begun to merge with nature itself, that the lotus has become their marker, their proof of passage. Their evidence that reincarnation for such beings follows not an invisible path, but one written in petals and stems and roots that push through soil. The mechanism operating beneath this belief rests upon the idea that consciousness possesses a tangible energetic signature, that when purified through discipline and spiritual practice, this energy can influence the natural world at a fundamental level, attracting seeds that lie dormant, encouraging growth in impossible circumstances, and aligning botanical cycles with the precise moment of a master's death or entombment. This concept merges quantum uncertainty with botanical metaphor, suggesting that observation, intention, and spiritual development can collapse probability waves in favor of miraculous blooming, that the natural world operates as a responsive medium to consciousness rather than as a mechanistic system indifferent to human aspiration. Consider the experience of profound forgetting, the moment when a person encounters someone they once knew intimately and feels nothing, no recognition, no resonance of connection across what should be an eternal continuum of consciousness. In the theory of soul erasure, reincarnation does not guarantee the persistence of your essential self across lifetimes, but rather proposes that souls can be systematically wiped clean of their histories, their accumulated wisdom, their relationships and bonds, as if an invisible hand reaches into the fabric of existence and deletes entire chapters of experience. Imagine a soul arriving in a new body with absolutely no thread connecting it to its previous lives, no intuitive knowledge, no residual emotional attachments, and no karmic debt that might otherwise bind it to familiar faces and familiar places. The mechanism proposed here suggests that certain cosmic forces or universal administrators deliberately erase souls as a form of consequence or renewal, perhaps when a soul has become too corrupted by trauma, too burdened by guilt, or too entangled in karmic loops to move forward meaningfully. This erasure would be complete and merciful, returning the consciousness to something approaching a blank slate, allowing for a fresh beginning untainted by the weight of previous existence. Yet we continue living surrounded by the evidence of such erasure, encountering strangers who once meant everything to us, feeling inexplicable dread or attraction to people we have never met, unable to explain why certain lives feel like echoes of something we cannot quite remember, accepting these phenomena as coincidence and fate rather than glimpses of our own forgotten histories, as if our minds have evolved to normalize the greatest tragedy imaginable. The complete severance from our own eternal self. The Law of One is a metaphysical framework that emerged throughout the 20th century, particularly gaining prominence through the channeled teachings received by a group known as L&L Research during the 1970s and 80s, which suggests that all consciousness in the universe is fundamentally interconnected and originates from a single unified source, often referred to as the infinite creator or the one infinite creator. And that reincarnation operates not as a mechanism of punishment or karma in the traditional sense, but rather as a graduated learning system whereby individual souls deliberately choose incarnations across multiple lifetimes to experience different densities of consciousness and gather experiential knowledge that ultimately serves the evolution of the unified whole. Within this framework, the mechanics of reincarnation become less about personal moral accounting and more about what practitioners describe as service to self versus service to others' orientations, proposing that each soul progresses through dimensional densities or planes of existence, with Earth representing a particular classroom where third-density beings learn the fundamental lessons of free will, consequence, and the illusion of separation. The psychological appeal of this theory lies in its simultaneous provision of both cosmic meaningfulness and personal agency, as it suggests that your current incarnation was consciously chosen by your higher self before entering physical reality, which transforms suffering and limitation from arbitrary tragedy into deliberate curriculum, thereby rendering even the most painful earthly experiences as purposeful spiritual investments rather than meaningless misfortune. The philosophical mechanism operates by collapsing the tension between determinism and free will, between cosmic order and individual choice, by suggesting these apparent opposites are actually complementary aspects of a single unified system where predetermined soul contracts coexist with genuine free will within those parameters. Consider the theory that human consciousness, upon the completion of its earthly existence, may descend into the biological form of plant life, where the soul experiences existence in an entirely different dimension of awareness, rooted quite literally to a single location and bound by the constraints of photosynthesis and seasonal cycles. This particular belief suggests that individuals who have lived lives characterized by minimal ambition, passive acceptance of circumstance, or spiritual stagnation might find themselves reborn as a common oak tree, a wildflower blooming in an untended meadow, or perhaps a humble houseplant residing on someone's windowsill for decades. The theory proposes that plants possess their own form of consciousness, one that operates on a vastly different temporal scale than human perception, where a single season represents what might feel to the plant like an entire lifetime of growth, adaptation, and subtle interaction with the world around it. Advocates of this notion point to the measurable responsiveness of plants to their environment, their apparent communication through root systems and mycorrhizal networks, and their capacity to remember trauma and respond to stimuli, suggesting that some form of sentience or awareness must necessarily accompany these behaviors. Psychologically, this theory appeals to those who wish to understand suffering and punishment within a reincarnation framework, offering a mechanism by which a human soul might experience consequences through prolonged immobility, silence, and isolation from social interaction. The concept also resonates with environmental consciousness and the romanticization of nature, providing a comforting narrative in which all living things possess inherent value and spiritual significance. In certain Tibetan Buddhist traditions, there exists a practice known as Phawa, which translates roughly to transference of consciousness or ejection of consciousness, and it represents one of the most deliberate and ritualized approaches to controlling the trajectory of one's rebirth after death. According to the teachings that have been preserved within these spiritual lineages for centuries, a practitioner who has cultivated sufficient meditative skill and spiritual understanding can consciously direct their consciousness at the moment of death away from ordinary rebirth cycles and toward enlightenment or toward a more favorable realm of existence, perhaps toward the pure land of a particular Buddha. The practice involves highly specific visualizations, breathing techniques, and meditative concentrations that are said to awaken subtle energy channels within the body. And through this activation, the consciousness can be projected outward through an opening at the crown of the head, which is believed to be the exit point for a spiritually advanced soul. Some accounts describe practitioners who have trained in Phawa displaying unusual physical signs at death, such as warmth remaining in the top of the skull even as the rest of the body grows cold, or a small opening appearing in the fontanelle area, suggesting that the consciousness has indeed departed through this mystical portal rather than through the ordinary sensory channels that untrained individuals rely upon. The psychological mechanism underlying Phawa seems to operate through the profound power of intention combined with intense visualization, and the deeply embodied nature of meditative practice within a coherent cosmological framework. When a person believes with absolute conviction that their focused attention and years of mental cultivation can directly influence the mechanics of death and rebirth, that belief becomes neurologically real in terms of the brain states it generates, the emotional responses it produces, and the narrative meaning it imposes upon the dying process itself. Imagine a vast, ancient tree that exists somewhere between the physical world and the spiritual realm, its roots extending infinitely downward into the earth, while its branches stretch endlessly upward toward the cosmos. And according to this peculiar theory of reincarnation, every soul that has ever existed or will ever exist is represented by a single leaf upon this magnificent and incomprehensibly large tree. When a person is born, their leaf unfurls from a branch, glowing with a soft luminescence that reflects the unique essence of their consciousness, and during their lifetime, this leaf grows and changes color based on their experiences, their choices, their moral actions, and the spiritual development they achieve throughout their years in the physical form. When death arrives, the leaf does not simply fall away into oblivion, but rather transforms into a seed that carries within it the concentrated wisdom and memories of that entire lifetime. And this seed travels downward through the branches and trunk of the tree until it plants itself somewhere within the root system, where it lies dormant until the moment when conditions align perfectly for its germination and return to the branches as a new leaf, a new life. A new opportunity for growth and understanding. The psychological mechanism underlying this imagery draws from our deep human need to perceive continuity and meaning in existence, to believe that nothing we experience is ever truly wasted or forgotten, and that each person's journey contributes to some vast, ordered system rather than dissipating randomly into meaninglessness. We have normalized this particular vision of reincarnation because it combines the aesthetic beauty of nature with the comfort of cosmic order, allowing us to imagine that our lives are literally part of something greater than ourselves, something ancient and wise and patient, waiting eternally to receive us back into its embrace. And this metaphor persists in our collective imagination precisely because it requires no scientific explanation and offers instead a poetic resolution to our deepest anxieties about mortality and purpose. Imagine for a moment that souls, rather than being eternal and indivisible essences, are instead commodities that can be valued, traded, and exchanged according to supply and demand, much like stocks or real estate in our modern economy. Under this theory, reincarnation operates as a sophisticated marketplace where souls of varying quality and spiritual worth are bought and sold by celestial intermediaries, with the price of rebirth determined by one's accumulated karma, past achievements, and desirability to potential parents or circumstances. A soul with exceptional merit from thousands of lifetimes of virtue might command premium placement into the body of a wealthy genius in a peaceful nation, while a newer soul with significant karmic debt might find itself assigned to the cheapest available slot, which could be a struggling body in difficult circumstances, with the universe functioning as an efficient market that balances supply and demand across all rebirths occurring simultaneously. The psychological mechanism behind this theory likely stems from our deep familiarity with market economics in modern life, where nearly everything from our time to our attention to our organs can be quantified and priced, and so it becomes natural to project this same capitalist logic onto the supposedly spiritual realm, transforming the abstract notion of karma into something resembling a credit score or financial portfolio that determines our options and opportunities. We have become so accustomed to seeing value assigned to all things, to believing that everything has a price and that scarcity drives worth, that even when contemplating the eternal and the sacred, we unconsciously revert to the language and logic of commerce. Consider the peculiar notion that not all souls reincarnating on Earth have experienced previous lifetimes, and that some consciousnesses are, in essence, brand new arrivals to the cycle of birth and death, stepping into physical form for the first time with no ancestral memory or karmic weight behind them. This theory suggests that the universe continuously generates fresh souls, unburdened by past life trauma or accumulated wisdom, entering the world as genuinely virgin consciousnesses who must begin their evolutionary journey from absolute zero, which would theoretically explain why some individuals seem to possess a kind of innocent naivety or lack of certain intuitive knowledge that others appear to carry innately. The psychological mechanism supporting this belief rests on our observable differences in maturity, wisdom, and spiritual awareness across populations, and rather than attributing these variations to simple factors like upbringing, education, or temperament, the New Soul theory provides a comprehensive metaphysical explanation that feels satisfying because it accounts for why some people seem ancient and knowing, while others seem perpetually young or naive in their understanding of existence. This concept has persisted across numerous spiritual traditions and modern reincarnation communities despite the logical complications it presents, particularly the question of where these new souls originate if consciousness is theoretically eternal, or whether the universe's soul supply is truly infinite, or if perhaps we are simply observing natural variation in human development and mistaking it for evidence of cosmically timed spiritual arrivals. We have normalized this idea within certain communities by creating elaborate frameworks that describe the characteristics and challenges supposedly unique to new souls, developing almost taxonomic systems for identifying them, and treating their supposed inexperience as a special status worthy of explanation and protection, all while remaining curiously untroubled by the foundational paradoxes embedded within the theory itself. Consider the peculiar human experience of encountering a person, place, or moment that feels inexplicably familiar despite having no rational basis for that familiarity, a phenomenon we have collectively termed déjà vu, yet imagine instead a framework in which this sensation operates in reverse, suggesting not that we have seen something before in this life, but rather that we are experiencing something we will see again in a future incarnation. As if consciousness itself possesses the ability to leak backward through time in moments of particular significance or spiritual alignment. This theory proposes that certain encounters trigger what might be called déjà vu from below, a preview of a soul's future incarnations rather than a memory of past ones, meaning that when you meet someone and feel an uncanny connection you cannot explain, you are not remembering a previous lifetime together, but rather sensing a forthcoming one, a reunion that has not yet occurred but somehow your essence already knows is coming. The mechanism underlying this strange notion suggests that consciousness exists in a nonlinear dimension where past, present, and future are equally accessible, and that moments of profound recognition or synchronicity represent instances where the boundaries between temporal directions momentarily dissolve, allowing a soul to perceive its own forward trajectory just as easily as it might perceive what has already transpired. What makes this theory persist despite its logical inconsistencies is perhaps our deep need to find meaning in coincidence and connection, to believe that the people who matter most to us are not randomly distributed across the universe, but are instead bound to us by invisible threads extending in all directions through time. And that every powerful feeling of recognition carries cosmic weight and intentionality, rather than emerging merely from the random firing of neural patterns or the brain's tendency to seek patterns in noise. Consider the Buddhist concept of the Pure Lands, which proposes that across the cosmos there exist multiple realms of existence that have been perfected by enlightened beings known as Buddhas, and that through devotion, practice, or even a single moment of sincere prayer, a dying person or soul might be reborn directly into one of these transcendent dimensions rather than cycling through the ordinary realms of rebirth, and that once arrived in such a pure land. The conditions for achieving enlightenment become so ideal, so saturated with spiritual opportunity and cosmic support, that liberation becomes nearly inevitable rather than requiring countless lifetimes of struggle. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory appears to rest upon a deeply human need to believe that effort and sincerity are rewarded with shortcuts, that desperation and faith can collapse the distance between where we are and where we wish to be, and that somehow, somewhere, a compassionate force has prepared a sanctuary specifically designed for those who call out to it in their final moments. This belief persists across centuries and cultures because it offers simultaneous comfort and aspiration. It suggests that enlightenment is not reserved only for monastic scholars or those blessed with perfect circumstances, but remains accessible to the ordinary person through devotion alone, through the simple act of remembering a Buddha's name as death approaches. What makes this theory particularly resilient is how it has been integrated into lived religious practice for over 1,000 years, woven into funeral rites and deathbed ceremonies in East Asia, creating a kind of normalized supernatural framework where millions encounter the concept not as strange mythology, but as reasonable spiritual geography, as real as maps showing continents and oceans. And thus it persists not despite its lack of empirical verification, but precisely because it has become institutionalized into the fabric of communities, schools, and families, where it passes from generation to generation not as questionable claim, but as inherited wisdom about the architecture of existence itself. Deep within the mystical traditions of Jewish Kabbalah lies a concept that challenges our conventional understanding of reincarnation, by suggesting that the soul does not simply move from one body to another in a linear progression, but rather that a righteous spirit may temporarily inhabit the body of a living person to complete unfinished spiritual work or to guide them toward redemption. This phenomenon, known as Ibr, which translates to impregnation or pregnancy in Hebrew, describes a temporary possession of sorts where an elevated soul enters a living individual with consent and purpose, distinct from demonic possession or unwanted intrusion, functioning instead as a form of spiritual mentorship from beyond the veil of death. The mechanism underlying this belief operates on the principle that the human soul is not a singular, indivisible entity, but rather a complex structure comprising multiple levels and components, each capable of independent function and interaction, and that righteous souls who have achieved enlightenment may choose to return in this abbreviated form to assist the living in completing moral obligations or spiritual debts that were left unpaid during their previous incarnations. The tradition suggests that a person hosting an Ibr would experience moments of clarity, sudden knowledge of things they could not possibly know, or inexplicable urges to perform acts of charity or justice that align with the deceased soul's unfinished business, creating a collaborative spiritual partnership that transcends the boundaries between life and death. What makes Ibr particularly intriguing as a persistent belief despite lacking any scientific validation or empirical measurement is how it preserves human agency and spiritual responsibility within a framework that could otherwise excuse our actions as predetermined or unavoidable, maintaining that even when visited by otherworldly presences, we retain the fundamental choice to accept or reject the guidance offered. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein individuals who have never met, who live in entirely separate geographical locations, and who possess no means of communication with one another, report strikingly similar experiences, memories, and knowledge that seem to belong to no single person, but rather to a shared consciousness existing across multiple bodies simultaneously. Imagine a woman in rural Japan describing, with perfect clarity and emotional authenticity, memories of a life as a merchant in medieval Venice, while across the world in rural Peru, a completely unrelated man recounts nearly identical details of the same existence, including specific family names, architectural features, and intimate personal relationships that neither could have encountered through conventional means. According to the collective soul theory of reincarnation, these parallel memories are not coincidental, but rather represent fragments of a single vast consciousness that has fragmented itself deliberately across multiple incarnations, experiencing different lives simultaneously through different human vessels, like a single mind distributed across an entire network of individual brains. The psychological mechanism underlying this conception seems to emerge from our deep human need to explain those uncanny moments of profound connection we experience with strangers, those inexplicable instances where we meet someone and feel we have known them for centuries, or when multiple people report the same dream on the same night despite having no connection to one another. We have, through generations, normalized the idea that consciousness might be far more distributed and collective than our modern neuroscience suggests, perhaps because isolation and fragmentation feel increasingly unbearable in the modern world, and the notion of a shared soul provides comfort and meaning that individual reincarnation cannot quite deliver. Imagine a vast, invisible educational system that spans not just one lifetime, but countless lifetimes across centuries and millennia, where each human being is enrolled in a personalized program of spiritual development that no conscious mind can remember signing up for yet somehow must complete before achieving final transcendence or liberation. This is the concept known as the soul's curriculum, a theory proposing that reincarnation itself functions as a structured learning process, where the soul deliberately chooses or is assigned a series of increasingly complex life experiences designed to teach specific lessons, develop particular virtues, and gradually elevate consciousness through repeated incarnations until perfection or enlightenment is achieved. The mechanism underlying this theory suggests that the universe operates with an almost scholastic intentionality, where suffering, joy, failure, and success are not random occurrences, but carefully calibrated educational modules crafted specifically for each soul's developmental needs at any given stage. Proponents argue that tragic events we witness in life, such as premature death, disability, or overwhelming loss, are not meaningless tragedies but essential curriculum components, and that some souls might deliberately choose difficult circumstances specifically to accelerate their spiritual growth or to help other souls learn their own lessons through witnessing or participating in shared hardship. The theory also suggests that we might encounter the same souls repeatedly across different incarnations in different relationships. The parent who hurt us returns as our child, the friend who betrayed us returns as our teacher, and through these repetitions, patterns are finally broken and understanding is achieved. Consider the peculiar experience of waking from a vivid dream in which you lived an entire lifetime, complete with memories, relationships, and a sense of continuous identity spanning decades or even centuries within the dream's internal logic, only to realize upon waking that merely a few hours have passed in the waking world, yet the dream life felt entirely real and coherent while you were experiencing it. The dream life theory of reincarnation proposes that what we call reincarnation might not be the sequential passage of souls through multiple physical bodies across different historical periods, but rather the phenomenon of consciousness experiencing complete alternate lifetimes within the dream state, where a single night's sleep could contain the subjective experience of multiple incarnations, each one possessing its own sense of linear time, causality, and accumulated memory. According to this framework, a soul or consciousness might not literally be born into a new body after death, but instead enters into a permanent or semi-permanent dream state where it constructs and experiences elaborate fictional lives with the same neurological intensity and emotional weight as waking reality. The mechanism underlying this theory rests upon the observation that human consciousness during sleep demonstrates remarkable capacity for temporal distortion and narrative construction, essentially creating entire worlds and timelines that feel absolutely authentic from within the dream, with no awareness of their illusory nature until the moment of waking, which suggests that consciousness itself possesses the inherent capacity to generate realities indistinguishable from waking experience. What allows this theory to persist despite lacking empirical validation is perhaps our intuitive recognition of dreams' psychological power and their ability to simulate reality so convincingly that we have collectively normalized the strange possibility that existence itself might be fundamentally dreamlike in nature, that the boundary between dream and waking might be far more permeable than our rational minds prefer to acknowledge.